Coming up on this episode.
And had it not been for the U.S. Navy, I'm sure that the regional war would have been. So the U.S. Navy, largest aircraft carriers, is parked outside of the coast of Lebanon. Or mess with Hezbollah, you also mess with Iran. And that's why they're always so much more worried about them, because you're facing a state that has huge capabilities. But what Hamas is really good at is financing. At the three top Hamas leaders who are living in Qatar, etc., they are worth around $10 billion.
That's an extraordinary wealth.
That's extraordinary wealth. And
how?
They do it through multiple ways. But they would have fighters go and lie in their graves so they can feel what it feels like.
That's powerful.
And then in these group dynamics, they would also videotape them giving their last testimony. So if you videotape someone, then you can't really back out,
totally,
right?
Totally. Yeah. Oh my God.
So when you entered into ISIS territory, you had to fill in a form of 23 questions. And it's like a control form of who you are, who are your parents, what's your home address, who got you in contact with ISIS, why did you come, what route did you take, etc. So every single ISIS recruit has one of those files. While they were being interviewed also to check that there are no spies, they also identify people who could potentially also be reinserted back into Europe.
What is the scariest terror group you've ever studied?
ISIS.
Why?
They are so brutal, beheading, this sort of complete lack of any boundaries, even when you kill.
That was Dr. Magnus Ranstorp. He's a Swedish academic, hostage negotiator, teacher, and author who has been researching and writing about terrorism for more than 30 years. He is an encyclopedia on modern terrorism and political violence. He was also the very first author to seriously map out the Lebanese Hezbollah and its connections to Iran, Syria, and international terrorism. So, therefore, the insights and experience Magnus brings to the current moment are extremely valuable. And as you can see, this is a rather long one. Magnus and I met to do this in person, and I'm reminded again how much better these podcasts turn out when I get to sit across from the guest. And so, therefore, to sit with more guests, I need more resources. And to get more resources, I need something from you, my dear listener. I need those juicy reviews. So please, let's round out 2023 plus 200 reviews on Spotify. And that's 5 stars. That's 5 stars on Apple, Goodreads, I don't know, Audible, wherever you listen to the podcast. Pump your good juice into the various algorithms. It does absolute wonders at 2 things: attracting advertisers, but more importantly, providing some type of authority to a potential guest. So pump in the good juice. I notice every single one of them. So keep them coming. But back to the interview. For this particular one, there are timestamps. So use them as a guide to navigate through. But I hope you do settle in from beginning to end, because Magnus is a compelling communicator on these topics, and we cover much more than just Hamas and religious terrorists. In this conversation, we also cover Norway's most horrific terrorist attack in its history, and as Brevik. Magnus talks about how Sweden has become the #1 European enemy of the Islamic world. Magnus reflects on his career. He notices serendipity. He takes us on a tour of Gaza. He emphasizes and highlights the effectiveness of the financing behind all of these organizations. And really, I'm not exaggerating, a hell of a lot more as well. So please share with a friend or a family member or a colleague who you think would be interested. But with absolutely no further ado, here is Dr. Magnus Ranstorp. All right, Magnus, how has terrorism changed over the course of your lifetime?
Well, I was born in the 1960s, and of course, there were different issues. In the 1960s, you had Palestinian groups, that whole alphabet soup that was around. You had different factions uniting under the umbrella of the PLO. You had the 6-Day War, of course, that propelled some of them to undertake action, and then there was a massive explosion of hijackings during that period. And in fact, of course coincided also with the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War and the student protest movements, the New Left, really created the perfect storm for a whole generation. In fact, it is still impacting us today when it comes to the legacy of this. And it's coming back actually now to sort of reverberate when it comes to the Israeli-Hamas conflict. It's the same kind of forces that are coming back that was present in the 1970s. During that period, too, the Palestinians wanted to internationalize their cause. And they tried different methods. They saw also, of course, that the sort of French colonial control over Algeria had become successful in sort of trying to wrest off the French rule, and so therefore they took to hijacking, and there was a spate of hijackings occurring in the late 1960s, early 70s. It also coincided with the fact that you had satellite TV or sort of TV was developing. So you had a combination of new communication, traveling around the world through planes became easier. The media became worldwide, more global. And those coincided with causes like the Palestinian cause that sort of married itself to left-wing causes and the student movement and the protest and the revolt among the young generation, which also meant that you had uprisings in Europe. For example, the Baader Meinhof gang and the Rote Armee Fraktion and the other left-wing groups that saw in the Palestinian cause, a David and Goliath cause, where it was very clear who was the colonializer, who was the oppressed, who had the power, who was the victim. And in fact, what happened during that period was also that these Palestinian groups, etc., they were supported by these left-wing terrorist groups in Europe, the Red Army faction and the Red Brigades in Italy, the fighting communist cells in Belgium. They all came together, and in fact, some of those Red Army factions, for example, participated in Palestinian training camps in the Middle East. It's just like in the movies. There have been movies that have shown this. For example, when groups are training in Libya, you had the IRA, you had the other groups that were all coming together. So you had like a real perfect storm, ideological perfect storm, etc. But let me add one level of complexity. It was also within the realm of the Cold War. The Cold War competition between the United States and Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact. And many of in fact, the Russians claim that they were the one inventing the hijacking instrument to as a pressure point. So they funded Palestinian groups. They trained Red Army faction people as well in East Germany with Stasi. But also there was a university, Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, where you had revolutionaries going, Palestinians. You had other people going there. And so they sort of used terrorism also, was not done just by ideological causes, left-wing causes, etc., or Palestinian causes, but they were also sponsored by the Soviet Union. It was part of a battle, a hybrid warfare by the Soviets against the West, and that has continued to this day. But of course, terrorism changed over time. So you had Palestinian groups. They also used terrorism to get, for example, the PLO and Palestinian factions used terrorism. In the Munich Olympic Games, they received observer status at the UN because of terrorism. They was a spate of hijackings, etc. But then, of course, the West woke up and said, look, we have to do something about this. So they developed X-ray machines. And the X-ray machines then meant that the terrorists had to be more innovative. And that gradually over time led to terrorists using plastic explosives and trying to smuggle in different types of weapons on board through ingenious ways. So in all of this, right? So you have in the 1980s, terrorism becomes also more lethal. Why? Because we arrest the first generation of leaders who are more ideologically prone. The second generation in the 1980s becomes more bloody. You have more indiscriminate attacks, like the Abu Nidal group. They undertook Palestinian group. They undertook very deadly operations against airports, where they threw hand grenades, they shot the passengers down, etc. And then, of course, you had the end of the Cold War, and the end of the Cold War also meant that some of those groups died. Right? They died ideologically, they died slowly, and we had a new era, and that was sort of one strand of a multi-strand development. On top of that, you had an earthquake moment in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, where the Shah of Iran was overturned, and it showed that the impossible was possible. The Shia revolution in Iran also meant that Iran needed to export its revolution. So they began to export Shia groups in the Gulf, but also its biggest prize was in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And then began a wave of religious-motivated terrorism with Islamism.
It wasn't religious-motivated before?
It was there were religiously motivated actors before, but most of the Palestinian actors, they were Marxist-Leninists. They were secular, and therefore
political radicals rather than Islamic radicals.
Political radicals, etc. And while they were hijacking away in Europe, then of course you had another development sneaking quietly that has implications today. The Muslim Brotherhood expanded their activities in the Middle East. And particularly it had an impact because it came to Gaza and to the West Bank and so on. So they began developing social structures for the Muslim Brotherhood that grew into what would later become Hamas. And Hamas is operating on all these different levels, on the social level, on the political and religious level. But it took until 1987 when they were founded to become what they are today. And they call themselves, of course, the Arabic acronym for the Islamic resistance movement.
This is Hamas?
This is Hamas. The Muqawama. Resistance happens on all fronts, and they are mutually reinforcing. So if you strike at Israel, Israel will strike back. And then, of course, Hamas can move in with social services and take all these sort of people who have been affected by it, and then they can convert that into supporters, and they began acting when we had the Israeli-Palestinian peace process in the early 1990s with the so-called Oslo Accord, and that's when they began acting because they wanted to sabotage any peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. I'm not sure that Israel was really. They were prepared to make concessions, etc. But after Hamas began acting and after they assassinated, there also was a Jewish extremist assassination of the architect Yitzhak Rabin. The whole peace process sort of died a slow death, and the Israelis started to create facts on the ground to, that you can negotiate with in the trade. And Hamas, of course, in this sort of situation, only entrenched themselves even deeper into this. It's complicated to explain all of these things because someone once told me, a senior person who worked within. He was a senior MI6 head. He said at a conference I attended that trying to understand sort of politics in the Middle East is extraordinarily complicated. It's like playing three-dimensional chess underwater with all the pieces moving simultaneously. So if you don't understand the macro or the meso or the micro, and there are multiple games being played at the same time, you're not going to be able to handle all of the things. It's like life in general, right?
Could you speak more to the nature of the change? I thought you said something really interesting there, commenting how once the X-ray was brought in, the terrorism became more bloody because they had to be more innovative about the weaponry they brought in. So in your career since the 60s, well, born in the 60s, but at least maybe the 80s when you're really working on this, how has it changed?
Well, I became interested in this really in the 1970s, 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, etc. And it has changed in relation to, it takes different leaps in relation to technology, in relation to countermeasures that is being done. So you had the X-ray for trying to foil hijackings, etc. Then the terrorists moved to plastic explosives and trying to circumvent, trying to be ingenious about how do they smuggle on board these things. Of course, we saw the consequences of not, failure of imagination, of not having even thought through that you can use an aircraft as an implosion weapon, so you can actually sort of crash them into buildings, and then you have multiple effects, and also if you have a camera, you can film it, right? So if you have two crashes into the World Trade Center, you will make sure that at least one of them will be filmed, and the aftermath and so on. So it's also creating the shock effect. One of the largest, following 9/11, one of the biggest terror events that we foiled, or luckily we foiled, was the so-called liquid bomb plot. That was in 2006, which really involved the terrorists had trying to circumvent airport security, and they realized that they can use liquid explosive. And they used energy drinks, and they could inject liquid explosives into them so that, and then you can seal them. But you can actually build the bombs behind. You can smuggle in the different parts, and then you can build the bomb behind the airport security measures. And the plan was to you had a vast amount of hijackers who were radicalized. They were going to board aircraft at Heathrow and heading for North America. 7-8 aircraft were going to take off with 2-hour intervals towards the U.S. Once the first ones reached the U.S. shores or North America or Canada, they were also going to Canada, they would start exploding. So you would have sort of almost like a synchronized explosion. When the last plane had taken off from Heathrow, you would have 7 planes that would have been blown up in the air. You can also see how they tried to innovate and improvise. You had Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Very easy construction, but they tried to ignite his shoe, a bomb that was there. You had the underwear bomber, the concealment in the underwear. So you have all these sort of different ways. So the airport security is always always playing catch up. What can they use? Can you use drones as an attack vehicle, airborne attack? They realized that when Angela Merkel was doing a political rally, and some of her, this was not a terrorist attack, but someone had sent up a drone which circumvented the security, and all of a sudden that came onto the radar. You can actually use drones both to film but also to attack from the air. So you have to think through all these sort of different technologies, and that has sort of exploded. It's just you have to then start to think about how can we find ways to intercept terrorist innovation. How do they learn? How do they learn during their operational planning? And they're very, for example, in Gaza and so on, most of the rockets that they make are made from, water pipes, but also through experimentation, and also how you make explosives. And when you live under very tight conditions where you don't have a lot of things, the same thing with IEDs in Iraq, improvised explosive devices, being good at engineering, being good at sort of experimenting through different...
Turning scraps into a weapon.
Turning scraps into a weapon. You will then become very proficient. And the thing is to sort of try to find, and this is what the US have done in many different theaters, is to find the bomb designer. Not the one who delivers the bomb, but the one who designed the bomb. And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had one particular person who was making the sort of the printer cartridge bombs. You had the underwear bombings, etc. You had planning. Very clever people who were planning how do we circumvent security and so on. So there's a constant cat and mouse. This kind of innovation also happens on communication when it comes to how do they communicate without being intercepted. In 9/11, they were very clever because what they had done was that they, in order to communicate back to Afghanistan and to other places where internet was beginning to come. We didn't have really sort of social media to that extent, but how do you send an email without being detected? And what they discovered was that they wrote if you and I were going to communicate, we establish an email address and then we write in draft and we never send it. So you can go in and you can start editing. And I can start editing, and that's how they didn't send some of the emails. That means that if you are NSA or GCHQ or other, you will have to go in and break into the servers and to really sort of find. So that's what they did after 9/11. The internet cafes in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, etc., to try to see where are they sending these things. The same thing with if you use encryption, they can break encryption, some of the encryption. But you have to be able to do that in real time, and that's even becoming more challenging because you have so many different platforms, and you may even have sort of self-standing servers and other things. So that is a real sort of problem. Now you may have new technology. So how is AI going to impact today? This sort of sphere, you can for example, use AI to ask AI, what's the most vulnerable way in which I were to attack a particular target, and AI will answer, will scroll through. Or you can use self-driving cars, and you can in the future maybe when it's become more, you can just place a bomb on a self-driving car, etc. You can also do all sorts of things. So what the intelligence community and what others are doing is that they are really sort of brainstorming what are all possible ways in which we can try to do this. And they also test airport security. They test to see if it can be detected. And I think that's quite an interesting.
Regarding all this, what's the most creative thing you've ever come across?
I think it's pretty creative to when you're going to do such a big operation. You don't go sort of super high tech. You go low tech, and then you like 9/11 attacks. But you find all sorts of different ways in which which surprises you. Now, one of the things that really surprised me was how Hamas did this operation against the Israelis on the 7th of October 2023.
What did they do?
Well, it was such a large-scale operation. It required, actually it wasn't their operation originally. It was an operation by the Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon. 10 years ago, it was leaked that they had a plan to storm across the border. And when I say storm, through tunnels. They had built tunnels underneath northern Israel, South Lebanon. And they, even 10 kilometers in, and they were going to storm, once they emerged from the tunnels, northern villages and towns, and they were going to also attack from the sea with 5,000 men. Not the 3,000 that Hamas used, but 5,000. And they were going to kidnap people back to Lebanon, and they were going to kill as many as possible. So this what Hamas did was not their own thinking, right? It was out there in the open. And what Israel has been doing ever since then has been to try to shut down the tunnels, because they're more scared of Hezbollah than they are of Hamas. Hamas, they got pegged because Hamas is not going anywhere. They have control over the Palestinians, or at least I thought they had. And they relied too much on static technology. Most of the forces, IDF forces in the south, had relocated to West Bank because it seemed to be more trouble there. It was a holiday. It was an anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And what they did was they used drones with bombs to knock out the communication facility so that the IDF could not communicate locally. And then they broke through. They attacked the sentry towers and the towers. And before the Israelis could mobilize, you had people streaming across. And what I didn't realize from the beginning was that this was all across when you look at a map, exactly where people died or where they were kidnapped, etc., it stretches in the north all the way down 40 kilometers, because the Gaza Strip is 40 kilometers long, 10 to 16 kilometers wide at its widest. And you had 3,000 armed, or 2,500, 3,000 armed factions or individuals within these factions who were just there to massacre people. And they to actually do this kind of big operation requires coordination, and I'm still convinced, even though everyone denies it. The more you deny it, the more it looks suspicious, right? So Hezbollah is denying every single speech. They're denying. Why? Because they don't want to give the Israelis.
But what are they denying?
They're denying that they were involved. This was an entire Palestinian operation. So they don't want to give. And had it not been for the U.S. Navy, I'm sure that the regional war would have been. So the U.S. Navy, largest aircraft carriers, is parked outside of the coast of Lebanon. You got the British, naval, and they even submitted a U.S. U-boat, a submarine, which carries ballistic missiles, can also carry nuclear weapons. That's a signal to the Iranians. Do not, because Iran is also behind all of this. They provide support both to Hamas but also to Hezbollah. So Hamas is quite a sort of a complex organization, in that you have different committees. You have a Politburo composed of 15 people, and the highest person on the Politburo is Ismail Haniyeh. I happened to meet Ismail Haniyeh in 1998 when he became the assistant to the spiritual leader of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin.
Nice guy.
He was a nice guy. I'd never heard of him, actually. He was quite sort of, I mean, he was known, but he was not so visible, but he would become visible. He would become the leader of Hamas. He won the election in 2005, 2006, and he has been the leader. Still the most powerful person, very well groomed member, but he was helping the paraplegic Sheikh Yassin, who stark contrast. He's sitting in his wheelchair. He's helping him, and so you have this sort of board of the Politburo. You have also a council that is composed of all the disparate parts of Hamas. And then you have the military wing. And the military wing has around 30,000, 40,000 members. But the important thing is, when you look at the council that makes all this sort of decision, they are elected from different parts of Hamas. So you have a Gaza leadership, and the Gaza leadership, it controls, of course, all of the Gaza Strip and the territory. And you have Hamas in the West Bank. You have representation from Hamas in prison. You also have representation from Hamas in the external leadership. You also have representation of Hamas in the diaspora, in other places. So it's like a collective decision-making. Now, the highest leaders of Hamas, the ones, the Politburo, the ones who've been there a long time, who've been on the outside a long time, is based in Qatar. They have been doing a little bit of a traveling circus. They also have connections to Turkey. In fact, they travel back and forth between Qatar and Turkey. Some of the leadership was previously based in Jordan. And I have a funny story with one of the Jordanians. If you want me to tell you, I'll tell you that story.
We'll embrace the humor.
Well, we have to, because it's such a sort of
it's grim stuff.
It's a grim stuff, and I once met with one of the Hamas leaders called Mohammed Nazal. Mohammed Nazal, you have to understand that on the outside leadership, they and this is in the late 1990s when I met them, but also they've been continuing like this. Is that the ones who take the military decisions, they're based on the outside, so that the Israelis can't touch them. Right, so they can't come and assassinate them. They do sometimes try it, but and so I'm sitting. I actually have been asking Ismail Haniyeh for how do I get in touch with external leadership, etc. And then he doesn't really want to give me any phone numbers, but he gives me clues where I should look, and I find them, and I find all the numbers, and so I show up, and in the meeting, I come into this meeting, the person is mean looking. And in the outer office, there are machine guns. I mean, the people guarding him. And as I'm sitting talking to him, and we don't talk about any operationals. They will never say anything, etc. So we talk about, what do they want? Can they see any peace process? Where do they come from, etc. You have to dance around the fire. So I'm dancing around the fire, and this guy comes in with, his helper comes in with small pieces of paper, which he unfolds. And he's talking to me, he reads it, and then he shreds it. Right? And I'm thinking, okay, he's coming in with operational sort of, I'm so close to the fire now. But then all of a sudden he says to me, Magnus, he didn't say Magnus, but he said, you have to understand that the local units in Hebron came with an idea of an operation, and he has to prove it. So he asked them, what kind of operation do you have in mind? And he said, well, we want to kidnap an Israeli politician, was then the message relayed back. And his answer was, probably not in the way I'm relaying it now, but he was basically, don't be ridiculous. Have you seen the size of that man? It will be logistically possible. And the person that they had suggested was Ariel Sharon. And for those of you who don't know who Ariel Sharon is, He has been very, very controversial. He doesn't live in. He is dead. He doesn't live anymore. He was responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacres in Lebanon, in Palestinian refugee camps, etc., and defense minister. Very, very hated figure. Likud, very hard man. Now, the only time I ever met Ariel Sharon was in the Knesset, and I wasn't there to see him. I was in the Knesset, and someone said to me, "Would you like to meet Ariel Sharon?" That's why not. It would be great fun. It's not a big place either, so I said sure, but I didn't know what to say to him. So actually, what I told him was that you are too fat to be kidnapped by Hamas. And he loved it. He loved it. They like chutzpah, right?
Yeah, that's
balls.
so good.
Yeah. And he loved it so much. He said he looked at me, he smiled, and you also have to understand he has one eye pointing this way, other way. You don't know which to focus in on. And he smiles in his sort of little devilish way, and he says, "Do you think I pay for my bodyguards? They pay me. I provide a big shadow for them." So,
how big is he?
He is big. He was big. He was massive. It's almost like having two persons standing in front of you. Yeah. So that shows that even in the sort of darkest hours, there are also senses of humor. Yeah.
Since we're talking about Hamas, or since it was brought up, you mentioned in your opening comments about what the meaning of Hamas was. It was sort of like an attack on all fronts.
Yeah, so it means it's the Arabic acronym for the Islamic resistance movement. And that resistance takes place on the social front because Hamas is a religious social movement. They want to re-Islamicize society, and you have to do that by it's almost like the Swedish welfare state, right? From the cradle to the grave. We will, if you martyr yourself, you will pay the family for lifetime. You will, but also they reject any peace process. They want to annihilate or eradicate Israel. But they're also smart because they can be tactical, so they can call for a truce. But they say that the Palestinian land is a waqf, it's a sacred trust, not to be given away, not to be negotiated. So they're absolutists. But what they do is they maneuver, very cleverly. And what they did during the operation on the 7th of October was that they were faking that they were content with how it was, and they tried to keep quiet on the Gaza front. They prevented other groups so that the Israelis wouldn't put a lot of forces there. And also they made trouble in the West Bank so that the forces would go there.
And the media manipulation, then, it's completely intentional. This is a part of the attack on all fronts.
Well, for 2 years they were planning this operation. And for 2 years they planned the operation, and they tried to sort of show that it is not us you should be worried about. And the really interesting thing, it worked. I was in Israel 3 weeks before the 7th of October, and I listened to. I was at a terror conference north of Tel Aviv. The head of the IDF, the defense minister, and the head of Mossad was speaking, and they all were talking about Iran, and they were all worried about Hezbollah, but Iran and Hezbollah is almost one and the same because they support them so closely. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards support Hezbollah. They were there from its creation. It's the organization they really fear because they have really completely different weapon system. It's like fighting Iran on your border, but through proxy. And they operate together. They do joint operations. Sometimes very far away. Like in Argentina, they blew up the Israeli embassy. They blew up the Jewish Friendship Association. They operate so, if you mess with Iran, or mess with Hezbollah, you also mess with Iran. And that's why they're always so much more worried about them, because you're facing a state that has huge capabilities, technical capabilities, missiles, in terms of smarts, whereas Hamas they're operating on a shoestring, right? They have nothing. They have to improvise, etc. And it's difficult. They have to rely on smuggling, so they smuggle. But what Hamas is really good at is financing, and their global financial institutions have been revealed over time, but they were specifically revealed. They were specifically revealed when you had the U.S. Treasury starting to list individuals and list companies. And what it does reveal is that the 3 top Hamas leaders who are living in Qatar, etc., they are worth around $10 billion.
That's an extraordinary wealth.
That's extraordinary wealth. And
how?
They do it through multiple ways. One way is that they when they took over Gaza from the Palestinian Authority in 2006-07, they are taxing goods that are coming in, that are being smuggled. And how do they smuggle? Well, you have the Israeli border crossing in the north, and you have Rafah in the south. And they get about 20% of 20% of the how much the goods are worth.
So, for instance, several tons of cement is brought into Gaza.
Yes.
These 3 men swipe 20% of what that sale value is off the top.
That's right. And yes, and also they tax other goods. They levy taxes around 20% on top of what is smuggled in tunnels. So if it's not for Hamas, they will tax you. So you have a taxation system that works. They also have to try to they don't want to try to smuggle in. It's difficult to transfer money. You can do that, of course, through like a hawala system where you write credit notes, etc. But what they do also is, if you want to get a lot of money in, you buy goods in Egypt, or you buy goods, you then smuggle them in, and then you sell them. And that's how they can circumvent money transfer systems. So that
I don't understand that. Say that again.
No, so if you one way to circumvent this is to buy something big, costly, smuggle it into Gaza. So Iran finances something, and it's bought in Egypt, etc., and then it's smuggled into Gaza, and then it's sold for cash. And now you have cash. You convert goods to cash. Okay. Instead of, you cannot really wire money, because that can be seen, or you can, because these countries also want to conceal their involvement. Yeah. They also now use, they are very good at cryptocurrency.
Okay.
Yeah. So they are using that a lot, also with exchange houses.
And crypto's got so much blood on its hands.
Yeah.
I had on Zeke Fow 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he wrote a book called Number Go Up.
Yeah.
And among many other things, he documents the pig butchering in Cambodia.
Yeah.
And how all of these scams, underneath so much of their infrastructure, is Tether USD and then a million other coins that they convert into it.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy, just how dirty the money is.
Yeah, no, but also, I mean, they also have what they call, Hamas have an investment company, and that investment company takes all the money that's been levied. They also, of course, get humanitarian aid. So all the humanitarian aid is under the control of Hamas, even to the UN. So they take money from that, they siphon off money. Both from
these
the
three
person,
men
these three men, but also for the organization itself, and they have people who are controlling this investment fund, and this investment fund runs legitimate businesses in Turkey, in Sudan. They have a mining company in Sudan. They have a real estate conglomerate. They have
They're diversified.
They diversify the different types of investment. They have it in Algeria. They have it in other places, and they are very good at generating funding. And of course, they also have the diaspora, Palestinians living in Sweden, in Denmark, and other places who are collecting money. So they also send money, both to their relatives, but also they can be siphoned off. So they have, you have this sort of discrepancy between these poor people living in these, Gaza, ordinary people, poor, starving, having nothing, suffering. And you have these rich men who are living in luxury apartments in Qatar, in Turkey. They buy citizenship in Turkey as well, so you can. So it is so upsetting when you see what they are doing and the sort of wrath that they have created. Of course, with the Israelis having to respond. It's really interesting. Hezbollah is even better.
Yeah. Okay.
Hezbollah is good at generating money. They are good at storing money. They are good at concealing it. They're also good at moving money, right? And if you're good at all those sort of different things, then because money is the oxygen of terrorism. If you don't have money, you can't do very much, and therefore a priority issue is to try to, just like airport security, you have to try to find the new technologies. You also have to counter cryptocurrencies. You have to sort of see where you can identify how they're going to move the money, where they're going to store it, how can you hurt the organization by tackling the money. And that is a sort of also a really interesting front. So you have sort of what most people don't see is that the counterterrorism chase. You have these intelligence services who are thinking of how, what is happening in the organization, how do we keep ourselves safe, but more importantly, they're also chasing down leads of an organization, both physically, what is the person's doing together. They're doing it virtually through social media. How are they communicating? How are they spreading propaganda, etc.? Because intelligence services can also do a lot of interesting, scary stuff by going into your phone, going into your house, listening into. Once they get a sort of ping on the radar, once you are in the crosshairs, they can. It's pretty scary what they can find and cover. And then, of course, you have also on the financial front. How do you counter this? How do you find out how they fund themselves? Where are the vulnerabilities? How can you counter that? So it's a fascinating world.
A couple days after October 7th, I was watching SVT, and the guest, I forget his name, but he was a member of Sida, which is Sweden's governmental body that allocates financial aid throughout the world. And he was asked about money given to Hamas or to Palestine. I'm not exactly sure which, how it was directed.
Yeah.
And they asked, how do you know it's not being spent? And he said, because they promised me that they wouldn't spend it on this.
Yeah.
And I could not believe that was the official response from the government organization. Because, I'm sure you know the answer to this, but how many millions of euros has Sweden given to Hamas over the years?
I think it's difficult to say exactly how much, but it's the same thing if you give money to Syria and it's ISIS control. ISIS is going to take a big cut. You have to, you cannot operate in the environment without them taking a cut. And of course, what's also been the problem with Gaza, first of all, they don't know where the money is actually going. Part of it they do, but Sweden is a huge donor, so is the United States. But it's difficult to sort of count. You have corruption, and you have corruption scandals being unearthed all the time in operating and giving money, etc. And also, you're channeling money. For example, Sida channels money to the Islamic Relief. Now, Islamic Relief Organization, etc., have also connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, Hamas is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, does it go to the population that is needing, or does it go to the organizations? You can't see it.
So to return or to wrap a bow on the money in Hamas, because I think that's so fascinating, because it feels like if you could somehow really restrict, the income, then they have way less material to deal with to then make missiles out of, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Gaza is a disastrous economy. It's a tiny place. I don't know what they produce. So could you break down then a pie chart of the income for these three men in Qatar with billions and billions? You mentioned 20% tax on goods that come into Gaza, but that feels like it must be marginal since the economy will be so low anyway.
Well, it's more sizable than I would think. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but when I looked at the exact sort of, the economy, they are very ingenious, and they're not completely isolated from the world. There's real estate, there is hotels, the 2.2 million people living there, and so you have commerce.
Do we have a GDP of Palestine?
Yes, I don't have it here. Okay. I had to look it up. Yeah. But there is an overall GDP, and
this says 18 billion as of 2021 USD.
Yeah,
does that sound about right?
Something like that, yes. And but then of course you have also money being sent through remittances and so on, and you have development. Problem is that you have UNRWA, United Nations Work and Relief Agency, which is run mainly by Palestinians, etc. And the problem is that they've also been caught with educational material that shows that they are material that indoctrinates young Palestinian youth in terms of, the problem is that they teach the kids how to hate Israelis because they're part of a struggle. And the problem is that you have had a radicalization since Hamas took over, and they were isolated also by the young generation because they never met anyone. If it's not a soldier, you can only work, and this is what the Israelis did beforehand when they thought that things were calm and they were pretty amenable, was that they open up for work from Palestinians who are married, who have a family. Those kind of people can get work permits, some of them, only very limited number, to work in Israel, but you can get 10 times the salary you can get from Gaza. So I think it's gone on for such a long time. It's an intractable conflict. You cannot solve the conflict because there's so many moving parts. You have the sacredness of Jerusalem for both the Jews and also for Christians, but we don't care so much. I mean, even I don't know if you have ever been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
No.
There you have competition between different strands of Christianity who don't trust each other, and they fight so much amongst themselves that every night they lock up the church where Jesus was crucified and resurrected. And they give the keeper is Muslim family who has done it for centuries.
Oh wow!
For several times. So, but you have that. You have all the, it's really interesting because UNRWA are classifying also descendants of Palestinians through generations who are descendants of those that may want to return one day. So the number of people living on the outside who never can come back, the diaspora, some of them keep their keys to the houses when after the Israeli-Arab wars, in order to hope that they return. There's a dream that they return, the right of return. But there are so many who are living in Jordan, in Lebanon, in other places that it's completely inconceivable for Israel. It would be a suicide for Israel to let back all these people. And in the meantime, of course, they have to. It's a small country. Israel is a very small country. So you have the West Bank, and then of course there you have the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah and the other factions, etc. You also have Hamas there, but they hide themselves more. It's such a complicated conflict, and of course the Israelis also have settlers who are building settlements. They have increased those settlements, I think, 450% since they began the peace process, etc. So I mean, I actually met in 1993, 92, 93, you had the Oslo process, right? They came together under Yitzhak Rabin, and they negotiated Gaza, Jericho first. So let's sort of relinquish that to the Palestinian Authority, and they can govern that, and also the town of Jericho, which is sitting in the sort of Jordan Valley. And they did that, and then they said, okay, phase 2, we're going to do Oslo 2, so that would be the West Bank, and then they had different security arrangements there, etc. But as soon as they began doing all of this, Hamas began doing suicide operations and attacks to sabotage the peace process. And that now has gone on for 30 years, and there is nothing left. And you also have a corrupt Fatah Palestinian leadership. Mahmoud Abbas, he doesn't have many years left of him, and he hasn't held any elections. It's a corrupt elite, doesn't have any credibility with the population. What do? How do you get new leaders, and how do you get people who do not want to fight, who do not want to sort of do resistance? And so I don't see a way out of this. I mean, I sometimes listen to people on TV, and they talk about, well, we got to have peace process and peace, and there is no conditions for it. And it's even become completely intractable with what happened after the 7th of October. Plus, in Israel, we never had a worse, when I say we, in other words, the West, in terms of its relationship with Israel, we never had a worse government. We have a religious government. We have Netanyahu. We have settlements. We have religious settlers and religious extremists who are trying to become maximalist on their side. They want to create a Jewish state on behalf, on top of the Palestinian one. So I can't see how it's going to be solved. So we're going to have conflict there.
In perpetuity? In
perpetuity. And then on top of that, you got these guys in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the Shia, they are the proxies of Iran. They have missiles going after Israel. You have the Iranians who want to destroy Israel. And of course, we had some hope before, because you then saw that there's been normalization through the Abraham Accords. You've had normalization with the UAE, and now we're going to, maybe have it with Saudi Arabia. And that was all scuttled with this attack. So you then have to sort of understand that maybe Iran is behind it. Maybe Hamas wanted to do a regional war. They want the West Bank to rise up. They want Hezbollah to get involved. And everyone's sort of waiting now. It's sort of wait and see. They're in a holding pattern to see what is going to happen. How worse can it get? And of course, it's storming in the West, in Europe, on campuses in the United States, in the Western capitals. You have Israeli-Palestinian protests. You have massive amounts of anti-Semitism. You have massive amounts.
So surprising, eh?
Well, I wasn't surprised.
Really?
No, I wasn't. Well, I wasn't surprised that it existed underneath. But how do you turn this back into the bottle? and the Jewish community, the Jewish faith community, synagogues, etc., is already a massive terrorist threat against them. And this is from Al-Qaeda, from ISIS, from others. On top of that, now you also have this issue where they're going after individual Jews. They are going after them in their homes. They're going after ordinary people who have nothing to do with the conflict. And you got a riled up Palestinian community together with left-wing, should we say, left-wing extremists. You have a younger generation who doesn't understand anything about the conflict. I don't know if you've seen this. There was a funny film done. I don't know who did the film, but it said, "Look, will you?" I think it was in the U.S. Will you sign this appeal for peace in for supporting Hamas and peace in Palestine, right? And most of the people that they met, they said, "Yes, of course." But before you sign, let me read the conditions, right? And then it says, would you agree to throw homosexuals off the rooftops? Would you agree to a Sharia state? Would you agree to women being veiled and, having all the rights and freedoms that we have? And of course, they wouldn't sign it. No. But they don't understand the conflict. And yet, what they can understand is that this is a David-Goliath fight. That Israel is a militarily more superior actor, and of course they want to support the underdog, the Palestinians, because they have they are suffering through the population, etc. And what Israel, I myself has been involved with trying to help in a hostage exchange operation between Hezbollah and Israel. There were 3 soldiers and a businessman taken captive. I was the extended arm of a UN negotiator who sent me in because he wanted to be under the radar, or the mission was to be under the radar. We made contact. We had some contact. We weren't successful. There were others who took over the process, but there was 3 soldiers and 1 business person, Israeli Jewish. The Hamas now has 200 plus hostages. And previously, Israel has done massive asymmetric hostage deal. They have exchanged 1 soldier for 1,400 prisoners,
Wow.
Palestinian prisoners. In fact, the last time there was a big hostage exchange was when 1 soldier was kidnapped in around 2006-07. He was held for a long time, and then negotiated a deal that released 1,200, 300 people. And 1 person who was part of that deal is the head of Hamas in Gaza now, Yahya Sinwar. And so you can then imagine the trauma for the Israelis, who never leave any soldiers behind enemy lines, who allow for making these asymmetric hostage deals just to get back 1 of these people. Yeah. Then you understand what a shock it is for Israel, because they've never ever had such a big operation against them. They always, when in the past Hamas would do a suicide operation, it maybe can do a double or triple. In other words, there would be 2 or 3 people who would position themselves somewhere, and then they would pull the cord, so they would explode themselves, and then maybe 60 people would die. What the Israelis would do then would be to first of all, retrieve all the body parts of those who died, to bury them. But there's a special unit in Israel who does that. But also, they would find the identity of the person, and then they would go to their family, and they would use a bulldozer to take down the whole house. Right? It's like, I will crush you if you touch any of our citizens, etc. is a massive retaliation against the entire family as a deterrence. But now Israel has lost its deterrence, right? It's, so many people, and the level of insecurity is huge in Israel. And the sad part is that most of the people who were living in these kibbutz, they were actually, more liberal, more peace-orientated. They even employed workers from Gaza and they would pay them much more than they would be inside. And so this trauma, I think, is going to take a long time for the Israelis to get over as a nation.
I don't know if you would ever get over it.
No, and I'll show you one thing. Just to, I don't know if you've seen this. I'm going to show you. There is this map that was done. Let's see here. I'm going to see if I can find it here. There we go. This is October 7 map, and you can zoom in. And when you see the entire, you see these red dots here is where every single person died.
Wow.
1,200, 1,400.
So it's a map which pretty much shadows the entire Palestine and Israel border.
Well, Gaza, yes, with the Gaza Strip, every single. So it's from the north to the south. So I thought initially that it was just the area around the festival ground and maybe just a few sort of kibbutz around that, but it's actually from north to south. So when you zoom in on this, where the music festival, that's where the music festival was, right? So when you zoom in on that, right, you see how many people that.
Wow.
Right, and when you actually see the individual names and the individual dots, and you see where they died and where they were kidnapped, you understand the scale and scope of this. Right. Because it's so, during 9/11, 3,000 people died in the towers, right? And this is half of that. So, from a small country like Israel.
Yeah, I've heard if it was taken relatively to the size of the US, it'd be something like 120,000 people. Murdered, or something like that. And is this the most devastating terrorist attack on record?
Besides 9/11, yes. In 2008, the security services were warning there was a terrorist attack in Mumbai, and that was for 3 days. 10 people were inserted from Pakistan, and they'd never been to India before. And when they did the operation, they had GPS locators, which they followed. But when they broke into the Taj Mahal hotel, a very luxury hotel, etc., and they were massacring foreign guests, they were looking for foreigners. They were stunned by when they came into some of the rooms, both the luxury of it, etc. So there's actually recordings of them, these militant Pakistani terrorists, going in to massacre people, but they get so stunned when they come into the room and they look around and say, "Wow, this is all luxury," and and you can hear intercepts egging them on. There's a wonderful movie that shows
Hotel Mumbai.
Yes. Which shows the generosity of the ones who were working in the hotel, that they would not leave the hotel. They would not leave the hotel while their guests were under attack, which is amazing, beautiful movie about what happened during that day.
Yeah. To move us away from Hamas, Israel, Palestine, you mentioned before the liquid bombing, which was halted in 2006. I was wondering whether you have on top of your head a few, or just whether you have offhand a couple of other like 9/11 scale terror plots that have been stopped by law enforcement, and if you could as well just give a broader picture for how effective or non-effective law enforcement has been at bringing down the amount of potential terror attacks that have been attempted.
There was of course, the deadliest attack, but you want failed. Okay, or foiled.
And naturally, I'm sure a lot of that is under wraps, but just things that, leak through to your desk.
After the Mumbai attack in 2008, which was a very, very deadly attack, the person who had done the reconnaissance who actually gone to Mumbai to case out to do the reconnaissance, to film all the attack targets, he goes back to Pakistan, and he's a U.S. Pakistani citizen. His name is David Headley, and he then wants to do an operation against Jyllandsposten, the newspaper in Copenhagen. So he comes to Copenhagen and he starts casing out the newspaper, which is located in a very close to Nyhavn, the touristy place in Copenhagen. Big, massive building. It's actually next door to the French embassy today. And he goes into the paper undercover, presents a fake business card as a business person, and he cases it out. He then rents a bike. He mounts a camera on the bike, and then he bikes around the city. He cases out the soldiers on the parade with the big furry hats who are parading through the streets. He cases out other targets, the railway station, etc. And then he's there on a reconnaissance mission. He then travels to Stockholm to try to get people to do the operation. And he goes to Derby. And he communicates the plot back to Pakistan with the organization that's commissioned this. By that time, the U.S. intelligence had found out that he was about to do this.
Any sense for how?
I don't exactly remember the details, but I think that they had a suspicion. They arrested him. It could also be because of the Mumbai plot. That there were investigative leads. Anyway, what happened then is that there is four Swedes who are based in Stockholm who decides to do an operation. Now they have contact with the person that David Headley met in Stockholm, and they decide to do an operation. So they travel down to Copenhagen. Now, by that time, the Swedish security services have detected this. They informed the Danish security service. So now it's a joint operation. And they are actually casing out the apartment in Stockholm. And they then see that they rent a car. These guys are going to a hardware store to buy, they bought 200 plastic strips to hold hostages, and then they travel down towards Denmark. To make a long story short, one person defects from the operation halfway down.
You got cold feet?
He got cold feet. He had also, it was farcical. I would have loved to see the surveillance operation on that, because they were following with helicopter, they were shadowing the cars, etc. And all of a sudden, they don't have any sound in the car. So but apparently they started arguing, and he wanted to defect. He wanted to sort of jump. He didn't want to go through with it. But he is the one who has rented the car. So he wanted to sort of sign over the car to the other person. And they have to sort of, they go around trying to find a gas station where they had rented the car to I think it was a Statoil. And then they do, and then they do this, and then they go down. And then, of course, as soon as they cross the bridge, it's a Danish operation. But, of course, the safe house that they were going to use is the contact of the other person who jumped the car. And so they don't find very well around in Denmark. They found the guy, he has to come and collect them in the middle of the night. And of course they are being followed now by Danish security service who are doing surveillance. They know probably where this safe house is. They have gone into the neighbor. They have drilled a hole in the wall. They can see through the apartment. They have all the listening. And they show up, and they are in the apartment now, and they get up in the morning and they start to pray, and they start to talk a little bit about operation. And then the security service can't wait anymore, so they pounce on them and they arrest them. But what they were going to do was to storm the newspaper offices with an automatic weapon, with guns, with knives, and with 200 plastic strips. And the plan was to kill as many people as possible inside the
newspaper.
The newspaper.
And why?
Because Jyllands-Posten had published the Muhammad cartoon, the Prophet Muhammad cartoon affair.
Perfectly reasonable to kill a person over that.
Well, they completely they were also going to behead the editors who had commissioned it and throw their heads out the window. That prevented a big, massacre, but it was through a joint intelligence operation. I sat through the trial of these cast of characters, these four guys, very different, all of them. But the most important thing was that this was not just four guys who decided to go and do this. All three of the four had gone out to conflict zones, and one person had succeeded, and he had been out with Al-Qaeda for a year to train for this mission, and he was then deployed back to Europe. He tried to evade security, but they already had caught on to him. He flew into Athens. He then flew from Athens to Brussels. One of the guys in Stockholm drove down to collect him and then came back. But they were so different, all these four guys. And they were all convicted to 12 years in prison. Not very long in U.S. terms, but they received a sizable. So you have I would say you have probably 12 to 13 terror plots just in Denmark that has been prevented, that were related to the Prophet Muhammad cartoon controversy. Basically, all of them was about that.
What about now? If I'm just thinking of Scandinavian country, done something to piss off the fundamentalist Islamic world. I mean, Sweden is right in the center at the moment. You've got this idiot Rasmus Paludan burning Qurans.
Yeah.
So thinking from all of these potential terror attacks against Denmark, after a newspaper published a cartoon of Muhammad, what's happening now in Sweden, given all of that?
So what's happened in Sweden is that we have created. There are two events that created a perfect storm. One event was that there was a disinformation campaign, a malign influence operation that started in Sweden in the summer of 2021, when you had a Facebook group with pissed off parents whose kids have been taken into care because they were mistreated, and they all got together in this Facebook group. And some of them were Muslim, some of them involved a criminal clan member who had the kids taken into care. And they began sort of doing demonstrations outside social services, etc. And they were really sort of frenzied attacks against the social services. They were publicizing individual social workers' names and home addresses and where the kids went to school and so on. Very threatening. Now, all of these sort of smaller protests, they weren't that big. They connected to a social media influencer in the Muslim world, actually an Egyptian blogger called Mustafa El-Sharkawi. He is called on Twitter Shun Islamia. And what he does is that he doesn't like the West. He thinks that the West is in moral decay. He wants to warn Muslims from traveling to the West because things are in disarray here. If you're a woman or Muslim youth shouldn't travel to the West because we do not live you cannot be a good Muslim to live in this society. So what happened was that this social protest movement and they connected to this influencer. And he has 1 million followers, maybe more also, multiple channels. And there were other social media influencers that were sort of interviewing these families and these cases. So you have a connection between the local Swedish environment and you have the global environment through social media. And
so Sweden's being spotlighted just through this aspect.
And of course, once it was also picked up by the Arab media. So you have Al Jazeera, you have Al Arabiya, you have all the media outlets in the Arab world. This is a perfect story. You have parents who are crying, their kids have been taken into care, and the narrative that's being promoted is that Muslim kids, Swedish government agencies, social services are kidnapping Muslim children. And they're not only kidnapping them, but they're also placing them in homes run by pedophiles, where you are forced to eat pork, and where it's part of an assimilation strategy, so you can't be Muslim anymore, etc. So all these stories are baked together. The narrative is pushed out, but it has also it has a perfect dramatic formula, because everyone understands how upsetting it is for a parent to lose their child, etc. And they are longing for this, and then you have also this sort of David Goliath situation. You have single parents who have had 5 of their kids taken into care, and this bad state actor, social services, is doing this to Muslims, and that became viral. It became viral for a whole year, and there were hundreds of millions of people being fed this false narrative.
And when was this?
This was the real campaign began in January, February of 2022, and then it went all the way down to January 2023. And of course, at the time, you also had the Quran burnings by Rasmus Paludan, a Danish person who crazy extremist person who is burning the Quran just to provoke immigrant Muslim communities. On top of that, once he stops, you also have an Iraqi person called Salwan Momika, who is an Iraqi Christian connected to Iranian militias, and he begins to burn the Quran. And so you have sort of, you have a whole year of Sweden is at war with Islam being pumped out. And on top of that, you got burning the Quran. So you couldn't get worse. And what happens is that now the Muslim world is getting involved. They want to boycott Sweden. The international the Islamic Conference Organization threatening to boycott and sanctioned Sweden. But also terrorist groups start to understand that, look, if we attack Sweden, right, we will become real heroes in the Muslim world. So you have ISIS and Al-Qaeda who issued communiques threatening Sweden, and they're saying basically a couple of different things. There was also, of course, the uprising against the Quran burnings, which resulted in that the Swedish embassy in Baghdad was overrun, and they burned the embassy. But what these terror threats really said in the communiques was that we need to strike at Sweden. Sweden is at the spearhead of the war against Islam. We need to slaughter diplomats. We need to burn up embassies. We need to blow up embassies. We need to. They haven't learned the lesson of Charlie Hebdo, the terror attack against Charlie Hebdo. So we need to discipline them by striking at them again. The police, who is sort of giving the demonstration approvals, they need to also be a target. It's a legitimate target. So go into police stations and attack police. We need to blow up their soldiers. And this whole sort of theme of we need to of Charlie Hebdo, they were lifting up examples of the Nice attack in 2016 when there was a truck driving down Nice seafront promenade, mowing down people, etc. So they were lifting up these sort of inspiring examples and they were saying to followers, do these attacks against Sweden, and therefore the combination of the disinformation campaign against social services and the Quran burnings led to atmospherics that really put Sweden as the number one prioritized terror target. And what we had was when Sweden was playing Belgium in football in Brussels, a person who had been fed this or had listened to the propaganda decided to execute two Swedish supporters who he selected because they were just football supporters, because they represented a symbol of Sweden.
Yeah, and the story here is just they were tourists and they were identified as Swedes because they were wearing Swedish football jerseys.
Yes,
they could have been Australians.
Could have been Australians. Could have been anyone. There was no There was no sort of it's just a random thing.
But such is the hateful Sweden at the moment.
Yeah, exactly, and it's very hateful. And on top of that, now you have Israel Hamas and Israel Palestine conflict being superimposed on top of this threat. And we see the emotions running high in many of the different capitals. We see ordinary people maybe who want to be involved in this or support this. You see Palestinians. You see also extremist groups that are. It's a whole sort of soup of people who are very, very upset. And you have also the Jewish community who is being harassed, who is being hounded, and they are in Sweden, for example, in Malmö. There are about 200 people who are part of the Jewish community, and they, of course, feel under massive siege and being threatened, etc. And you also have all of a sudden a normalization of anti-Semitism. And at the same time, you have a humanitarian crisis in Gaza with people dying, innocent people dying because of what Hamas did. And of course, Israel is trying to go after its objective and to decimate Hamas as a military organization. And everyone loses out.
Everyone loses.
Yeah, completely.
It's like with this Rasmus Paludan fella. He is the single winner at the cost of absolutely every other stakeholder. Mm-hmm. Swedish society, the Muslim population,
Yeah.
the Swedish police,
Yeah.
Sweden's reputation. The only person is his own political gain.
That's right.
And maybe with Hamas, the only benefit is their own political gain.
Yes,
Because the Gazan population are clearly the biggest sufferers in all of this. Israelis, oh my God, I mean...
but I think, for Hamas, their popularity has really shot up, even though they're suffering in Gaza, etc. So
is there any way to know whether their popularity shot up within Gaza?
Well, you can't really, because there is no public opinion polls that's reliable.
So when you say they've popularity shot up, it's an expression from the rest of the Islamic world.
Well, it's the rest of the Islamic world, but also the few individuals. You can actually see this on Facebook, on other places, where if you go back, that does go back to on the 7th of October, and you see how they celebrate. And they know then that a lot of civilians has died. And so it's a sort of it's a natural, I think, reaction that they unite together, even though Fatah and Hamas are opposed to each other. They unite against the common enemy, and therefore the Swedish ambassador to Palestine, the Palestinian ambassador to Sweden, she said that I will never condemn anyone from the Palestinian resistance. And she's Fatah. So you can see that there are currents like that, but you don't know. I mean, I think that if Gazan people could choose freely, etc., they would not choose Hamas. Some would, because it's a religious organization as well. But it all depends on what society and conditions that they grow up in.
How much your comment that the popularity for Hamas has shot up since October 7th, how much of that is an expression of disinformation in the media versus just run-of-the-mill hatred of Israel and Jewish people? So really the question is, have they seen the same things you and I have seen and come to the conclusion that Hamas is in the right? Or have they been given a much more sensitive version of the events, and therefore all they're seeing in their media is Israel are the oppressors. We did nothing wrong.
Yeah. I think it's a function of the fact that most people have relatives down there who have suffered at one time or another. And they may not sort of, I think that they are celebrating because of some sick sense of retribution when they, when they see what has happened. And I've also seen that Hamas and others have been putting out this information that this wasn't done by Hamas. This was done by Israeli military. Right. So you have disinformation. You have also this uniting sense that we are fighting back against, and the resistance is fighting back against Israel. But what they're not saying is that they're killing innocent people. They are, putting babies in, burning them. They are executing innocent people, etc. And therefore, it's not. They prefer to forget what happened, and then go with the issue of the most important thing is the suffering Palestinians who are suffering at the hands of the Israeli military aggression.
So just selective.
It's
selective. Look at.
It is selective, and they and they don't maybe take in. They don't take in all of the raw sort of emotion. They cannot hold two thoughts at the same time, that both sides are suffering. And this is the problem with this conflict. It's so emotional. Yeah. It's so emotional when you have...
I don't know, yeah.
It's become sort of symbolic.
I don't think it's hard to sympathize with the people of Gaza.
No.
I think it's
who-
absolutely horrible. But rather than blaming Israel, why don't you turn around and blame the people withholding every single thing that would help you to get out of that?
I completely agree with you. It's unbelievable that that they are not seeing any further. I mean, why not just condemn Hamas, which most people would want, and it's the reasonable thing to do, and then also say, look, I abhor all the loss of life of civilians, and half of them are kids that are dying. Who can support that?
I saw like the most horrific graph of deaths under 5 years old in conflicts over time.
Yeah.
And this one is a huge outlier.
Yeah.
20, 30x the second.
Yeah. It's because it's so concentrated, the sort of...
2 million people live in the place the size of Washington, D.C.
Exactly. But what I don't understand is that, the people who have really nothing to do with the conflict, who are not sort of emotionally invested, yes, it's okay to be upset. It's okay to support. But many of them have gone to great lengths of harassing ordinary people who have no impact on the conflict. For example, in the United States, Jewish students who go to university, etc., they get harassed. Also, you get harassment of Muslims because there's so much focus on Hamas with people who have nothing to do with the issue. So, and I often, when I was in Gaza and Israel, etc., you have sometimes, you try to understand both parts. You can sympathize, you can be emotional about these things. But I often said to myself when I was going between two different worlds, between a developed sort of almost like Western style world in Israel into Gaza, where there were donkeys and horse and carriage and
explain to us Gaza.
Yeah, it's like
what were you doing there? Where did you go? What was it like?
Well, first of all, when you go into Gaza, you had to go through the Israeli security. You have to sort of convince them that you should go in, etc. And then there was a separate entrance because most of the Palestinians had to go through another entrance. So this was the VIP entrance, right, where all the sort of international visitors, diplomats, etc. And then we had the long walk. It was like a long tarmac walk on the road, and you can see Palestinian. It was like a dead zone, right? So, and you can see Palestinian offices and taxis waiting in the horizon. So once maybe a kilometer or so, and then you're there, and then it's chaos. Right? There are few roads that are paved, so the dirt roads, lots of sands, a lot of young kids, a lot of happy kids playing football, kids everywhere. And as soon as they saw that you were a Westerner, they were there tugging at you, right? Like anywhere, they would be tugging, begging for money a little bit or trying to get your attention, etc. And then you would stop, you would play football with them. You try not to, because if you start giving money and stuff, then it will never end. And then you would take the drive in, and it was very pleasant. I mean, it was, buildings are often half built as well. So they never finished building so you would see like 2 stories that were built, and then they started on a third, but they never really gotten any further. It's right by the sea. So by the sea line, you have some nice, they're very small and very sort of basic hotels. There was only one place you can get alcohol. That was a hotel called the Windmill until Hamas blew it up because they didn't like the alcohol.
Before this conflict?
Before this conflict, yeah. This is many years ago.
It's like domestic terrorism?
Exactly.
What's that about?
Well, against an establishment that was serving alcohol.
Oh my God.
Yeah. But it was very, it's very simple. It's very, and you would sit around, you would smoke nargila, which is sort of like apple tobacco. Life is slow, and I once went there. I based myself in Jerusalem, often close to in the Palestinian area, right on the borderline. There's no fence between them in Jerusalem. close to what is known as Damascus Gate, going into the old city. So I'm outside and living in a hotel. I used to stay at the Jerusalem Hotel. Had a nice patio outside the hotel, colonial style. It had grapes on the roof, so you'd be covered with grapes growing above you. And in one morning, I decided to go to Gaza to interview people in Gaza. But before I went there, I walked up to the sort of Jewish market downtown Jerusalem on the Jewish side. And they have this huge market called Mahane Yehuda market, where they sell fruits and vegetables, etc. I'm there in the morning, and then I decide to I walk around, I look, I believe I bought some grapes. And then I go back to the hotel area, and I jump in a collective taxi going to Gaza, where we just get in the car, and then we pass money forward, and then it's a set amount, and then when we get almost close to Gaza, I hear that there is some commotion, and then I understand that there has been a double suicide bombing in Mahane Yehuda market. There have been two people who walked in and with a sort of bomb and exploded themselves, and a lot of people died.
Why?
Because of the peace process. Because of they wanted to kill ordinary, Israeli civilians.
So this happened in Israel.
This happened in
I
Israel.
thought we were still in Gaza.
No.
Okay.
So Mahane Yehuda and the Damascus Gate and all this is in Jerusalem. And then I take a taxi down to Sharut taxi down to Gaza. It is a ways. It takes an hour and a half maybe. And as I enter in, I then understand that there has been a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. But I continue in to Gaza. And when I'm there for a little while, I get word that they have sealed off Gaza. So I'm now locked into Gaza. Nothing happens. No one bombs. Nothing happens. So I go to the seaside and I relax for a few hours. And then I make some phone calls to my friends, and they say it's okay if you try to get out. So I then went up and I got out. But Gaza is like a slow pace of life. Nothing really happens. And people make do with what they have.
And how much of it now is left?
Hardly anything is left in the north. You can probably, they need to rebuild probably the whole place. And this is Gaza City. And then you have, of course, refugee camps further down. And people have, nowhere to live, etc. So, understandably, it's a massive humanitarian catastrophe. But the problem is that, Hamas is controlling who gets in, who gets out, how much you let in. They're holding hostages. The Israelis are probably going to continue because they have to show the Israeli population that they have something to show for this war. They have exacted revenge.
Well, I had planned on getting to Hamas at the end, so we're only past my first question here. But obviously, we're not going to be able to get through everything that I had planned. But your book sort of goes through your career rather chronologically and documents some of the major terror events that you've studied and have worked with. So I'm thinking, since we've already done since we've already done October 7, there's really only two more I want to bring up with you. I'm sorry, do you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe it's useful just to sort of... The book that I wrote is like my professional memoirs of events that have shaped my career, but also it's a way of unpacking the events, the terror events that have shown how it has evolved over the years. And I really begin with Lockerbie, the Pan Am 103, when a Boeing 747 is blown up over 10,000 meters in the air over Scotland and going towards the United States, and there are about 250 passengers on board, and there is a suitcase on board, a Toshiba Boombeat. Inside this Toshiba Boombeat radio cassette recorder is about half a kilo of Semtex, plastic explosives. That detonates after about 25 minutes after it's taken off from London, 10,000 meters. The whole plane disintegrates, and everyone on board dies, and it lands on the little town of Lockerbie. On board are 35 students from Syracuse University who's going home to see their parents. So you have this sort of parts of the plane raining down on the countryside in Scotland, and it lands. Part of the plane lands in a collection of houses in Lockerbie, kills 11 people on the ground. And I was sent there when I first started to sort of really study this, to take it all in. And I was full of questions and stuff. But I felt that all the questions sort of disappeared when I saw the sadness in the whole town and the enormity of what had happened. And so I went there, and I had to meet, I met later on victims, a father who had their daughter, a 23-year-old daughter who was on board going to see her boyfriend who was in America, and she had just gotten into Cambridge to study medicine. And, you know, when he tried to identify her at the morgue, he couldn't, because she was so damaged. So victims became, understanding the victims, understanding that this is real people we're talking about, was important. And then, of course, as we progressed throughout my career, one of the first things I had to do with my supervisor was to organize a terror conference in London, and the foreign minister was supposed to come. And there was security, but the security wasn't good enough. And the Northern Irish Provisional IRA, a terrorist organization in Northern Ireland, had planted a person, a sleeper agent, inside the conference area, and they planted a lunchbox underneath the speaker's podium. And a sound technician found this lunchbox packed with explosives, maybe an hour or so before it was supposed to get off. So now I'm almost seeing myself, welcome to this world. This is not just an ivory tower topic. This is real, right? So my career was almost finished before it even started. And then I began studying Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a Shia group that was taking hostages and so on. I later then moved to Hamas, and Hamas was a Sunni organization in Palestine who were doing suicide operations against Israel to sabotage the peace process. I then also, right before the turn of in the late 1990s, I also began working with CNN. And we went out into the Middle East because we were noticing, or CNN was noticing, that there was something going on. The system was blinking red. So I spent 5 weeks with CNN in the Middle East. We were working on a documentary called One Day Soon. That day happened before we could get the documentary together. I then, I then got to see the material that was retrieved from Al-Qaeda's training camp, and we learned more and more. And being at the heart of CNN's operation was really fascinating. So I was looking at that as well. I then I then came back I then got to go to Libya under Gaddafi, the mad Colonel Gaddafi, to try to sort of help British Libyan rapprochement, because Libya had been involved in the Lockerbie bombing in 1988. And so I had been there, and then I went to the United States. And when I came to the United States in the early 2000s, because I'd been so much to the Middle East, I was placed on the terrorism watch list. That was a really interesting experience, because then you realize how important it is, the issue of human rights, when it affects yourself. And I'm happy that I had that experience. It wasn't fun at the time, but I was happy I had that experience. After being placed on that list, you just have to do more fingerprinting, etc. But mostly reserved for Muslims, right? So if you really felt anger against this issue. I then, at the same trip, I went to Latin America to do a conference in Latin America. And then I came back, and as I am entering back into the United States, I get pulled over by the Miami Immigration Service and the sort of what became DHS, and said, look, you didn't deregister when you left the United States because you were placed on this list. Now we're going to deport you. I said, where are you going to deport me to? And they said, Argentina. I said, I don't want to go to Argentina. Please bring me back to the UK. I got back into the US after having sort of held for 6 hours. And after that, I went, I then gradually went back to Sweden. And coming back to Sweden, it was a different environment, because in Sweden it was a sleepy place. So I traded sort of Anglo-Saxon comfort and the excitement of things happening and being in the middle of things, being in Sweden. And I've been in Sweden ever since, but there's also been very exciting things that has also happened here in relation to working on trying to prevent violent radicalization, etc. I'm not going to go through the rest of my career, but I think that...
but maybe you can pick up from Anders Brevik, and the reason why I select that particular event is because it's not religious radicalization.
Exactly.
So, obviously, October 7th and then the Paris attacks that I'll bring up later, this is fundamentalist religious radicalization.
That's right.
But I wanted to ask you what the similarities were between political radicalization and religious radicalization in preparation for Anders Brevik.
Okay, so you have most of the organizations that were in Scandinavia in relation to the radical or far right were neo-Nazis, and they were skinheads and others, and they weren't very sort of sophisticated. But there was an evolution over time when it came to radical, far right ideologies, and also I think Anders Breivik is like a black swan, right? It's a black swan event because no one was focused on someone, a right-wing terrorist, doing such a huge operation against a target that was, political youth, social democratic political youth. But when it comes to him, he had a troublesome...
and just reminds the audience who are largely in the US and Australia. Yeah. So they might not even know who you're talking about.
I think most people know who Brenton Tarrant is, who did a right-wing extremist attack in New Zealand against mosques with the GoPro, etc. But the person who actually did a similar type of attack against a different target was Anders Breivik, who was, I think, a 30-something Norwegian who had grown up in Norway, who was pretty sort of isolated as a person. He had a troublesome upbringing. His parents divorced. They did evaluations on him psychologically and showed that he was emotionally disturbed as a child. He showed no empathy, these kind of normal emotions. He then, of course, developed his own thinking and was surfing a lot on the internet. He was, of course, influenced maybe by the different theories at the time of counter jihad, which embraced Eurabia and sort of this plot that the population was being replaced, the white population was being replaced by immigrants, and that there was this conspiracy between the elite to replace the population. And today we call it the Great Replacement Theory, that you are replacing, we are facing a white genocide, that white people are going to become minorities in different countries, etc. Now, what he did was he was such an odd person that he wrote a manifesto, living in his mother's bedroom. And that manifesto is composed of different parts. It's a cut and paste ideological manifesto that is cutting and pasting and plagiarizing different aspects of a far-right ideology that includes great replacement, etc., evidence for that, etc. Now, this manifesto is 1,500 pages long. Right? So the other part is, okay, so if we have this great replacement and if we have this, who is then responsible for this? And the ones responsible for this is the Social Democratic Party, because they've been in power for a long time. And then he called them the cultural Marxists. And here it becomes really weird, because he then decides to do a point system of, if you assassinate particular persons, he had a list of persons too, you get points. So it's like the gamification of okay, so taking out revenge against this is going to then require you to follow certain rules. But he also created his own uniform, his own universe, that was a mixture of make-believe, almost like you dress up. What do you call it? The
Cosplay.
Yeah, a little bit, but with war, with a war theme.
I have no idea.
With
reenactments or something.
Reenactment uniforms, etc. So he creates this sort of whole world with point system, and then of course he does something very strange, and that is that he does a self-interview. So he is such a narcissist. So he decides to anticipate, once he does his operation, what will media ask. So he would he will actually preempt these kind of questions, which is very strange. He also, of course, talks about how he did prepare all of this. And the interesting thing about him was he was such an odd character and such an evil, manipulative narcissist with an extremely warped mind. But at the same time, he was very meticulous. So afterwards, after his terrorist attack, and I'll say a few words about that in a minute, the security service really decided, when they looked at all the events, trying to retrace everything, etc., was that they could not detect him, because he was so careful of concealing himself. So what he did was first of all, he decided to generate funding. The way he generated funding was that he found a guy in Indonesia who did fake diplomas, university diplomas. So he sold those. He earned a lot of money from that. And he placed those in offshore accounts so that authorities wouldn't find it. And it was multiple sort of accounts in different countries. And he would travel there to take out money, etc. He also, in order for the authorities not to sort of do any suspicion, he rented a farm. And he ordered fertilizers. So a farm, of course, if you're a farmer, you have a legitimate grounds to order fertilizers, etc., to grow your crops. He then experimented with what kind of fertilizer is best to use. So he then got grinders, and this is where he made a mistake. So he was grinding them down, the fertilizer, in order to make the bomb. So you have these pellets, so you have to grind them. But he underestimated the amount of time it would take to grind down. So he was actually planning a bigger bomb than actually what happened. He then also applied for 10 credit cards. He maxed out many of the credit cards. He actually had a lot of cash on him when he was caught. But what he did, for those of you who had never heard of Anders Behring Breivik or the Oslo attack, was that he rented a van and he packed it with explosives. He tried to email out his manifesto, 1,500 words, to thousands of people, but the operation was delayed because there was a limit to how many you can send out. So the operation was delayed. Otherwise, he would have arrived there earlier when the former prime minister would have been there, who he was going to behead. So he drives his truck with explosives to the government headquarters. He parks it, he wears a helmet, and he walks away, and the whole bomb explodes, and it, causes massive amount of damage. He then gets in a car, and he drives south for about an hour, 45 minutes, to a place where there is a ferry. And he's going out to an island where the Social Democratic Youth Party is having its summer camp, and there are lots of youths there. And children, youths, young people, young politically interested people who are having seminars, who are having camps, who are having fun. And
so his idea is that it's the next generation of this political ideology,
This is a political ideology that has let in all these sort of changes in society that he doesn't like. So he wants to erase them. So he comes in with an automatic weapon on this island, and he shoots everyone and everything that he can find. And he kills, I think, if I remember correctly, something like 80 people. And when the police catches him after a while, and they're very slow to respond, people are hiding out in this island, in these rooms, and begging for their life, swimming, everything. When the police catches him, they interrogate him, and he says that, look, I'm part of a bigger cell. Of course, he's lying, and that we're gonna do more unless you yield to some of my demands, etc. Of course, they found out that there was no one else, etc. I went to his trial on behalf of a newspaper to cover this, to comment on it, and I actually sat in the courtroom. And I've been to many trials. I've testified in many trials. Didn't testify in this trial, but I saw him, and I've never seen anyone like him, because normally, you would look at someone and you would see like emotion or some, mimic, some facial expression, micro facial expressions, some sympathy, some laughter, etc. But he was just a stone-faced person, evil incarnate. And I've later found out by talking to people who have been guarding him in prison, etc., that he's so manipulative that individual guards are not allowed to talk to him, and they change out the guards because he's so narcissistic and he's so manipulative that he's trying to exploit them and to gain an edge, etc.
And his condition right now?
He is facing 22 years in prison, but they can prolong it if he faces, if he's dangerous to society. But he, when he came onto the scene, his manifesto, of course, was read by many far-right extremists, and then there have been copycats of him trying to do operations. The really big one was Brenton Tarrant, who did this sort of horrific attack against the Muslim community in New Zealand. But we've had these sort of lone attackers who are writing manifestos, much shorter, of course, but then either create their own world or just try to justify why they are attacking particular groups of people. And of course, so you're really facing, these sort of lone attackers or who can do terrific damage. But then, of course, you have also the traditional neo-Nazis who, in the Nordic space, there was something called the Nordic Resistance Movement. But they are more like a military organization, right? So they don't do. They're menacing. They're a problem. They are a threat, but they are more predictable because they do not sort of do these sort of indiscriminate attacks. What they do, though, is once they go after people, they intimidate them. They even beat them up, etc. They intimidate politicians and others. The interesting thing is that I had a journalist once in 2017, 2018, I think it was 2018, who called me, who was a BBC journalist, and he said, "Magnus, you're not very popular in Gothenburg." I said, "What do you mean?" And then he sent me a picture, and that picture was a placard with my face on it. And I had made some statements against the Nordic resistance movement, and they did not like me very much. And I'm showing you now the picture of the Nordic resistance movement, and it has my face on the placard, and it said "criminal" underneath. And I was not the only person that they were highlighting, etc.
But Anders Brevik, would you class him as politically radical or just psychotic in some fucked up sense?
Well, I mean, it would be easy just to discount him as psychotic in some sense, but it would do everyone an injustice because, he was very logical. He can do very complex tasks. He's also...
It's not a question of his intelligence or his competency. It's more to get to the point of what are the similarities between political and religious radicalization.
I don't think he is a good example, though, of comparison because he's an outlier. But the ideology that you associate with far-right extremism there are certain similarities of very strong enemy, strong in-group, out-group, identification of enemies. For the neo-Nazis and others, they are focused on Jews. They're strong anti-Semitic. That we have this sort of global cabal of Soros and they are really focused on that. You also have sort of the alt-right that we've seen. Everyone remembers Charlottesville, etc. But these are like a global right-wing populist movement. And there the focus is, yes, a little bit on Jews, but more on Muslims. So they're very focused on Muslims. But they have the same sort of concept of the fact that our culture, our way of life, the white race is being threatened by white genocide. And while the alt-right is not sort of violence promoting, what they're trying to do is they are trying to sort of use social media, jokes, memes, etc., to make the unacceptable acceptable. Right? To make unacceptable jokes about joking about, Jews or others acceptable. And the social media is the vehicle through which they, exploit that. Whereas the sort of old National Socialism is to try to normalize National Socialism, so that, most people, when they hear Nazi, neo-Nazi ideology, etc., they think of World War II, etc. And what the strategy has been by these groups has been to try to soften the language. So those who are not ideologically savvy and saying, "Hey, look, what you're advocating is, Hitler and dictatorship, etc." They are baking together in a language which doesn't sound so dangerous if you don't, if you're reflecting on it.
Do you think people are more susceptible to radicalization with the internet?
They're much more susceptible to radicalization with the internet. I mean, before you had to go and travel and you had to sort of make contact, you had to have a desire, etc. Now you have kids who are exposed to horrific images, and while they're playing games, they can be groomed. Whoever they get into contact with, it could be a terrorist, etc. So definitely you're at much greater risk. And of course, if you start sort of looking at particular content, the algorithms will make sure that there will be more of the same that you seemingly like. And if you start looking at right-wing extremist ideology, which is just a few clicks away, which you don't ask for, but, oh, this looks interesting. What's this? It becomes more, it's like a spiral. And you can become more radical.
What are steps everyone must go through to get radicalized?
Depends. I think there are so many sort of individual predispositions that it's different from person to person. Some people are, have an asocial personality. In other words, they have low impulse control. They are adventure seekers. And that for them, it's about the adventure. It's about the sort of, a new vista, a new interest, going down to fight with ISIS, etc. They don't think so much about the ideology. They're not particularly involved. You may have someone who seeks to belong somewhere, and it may be, Hare Krishna, or it may be, ISIS.
Totally.
They just want to be part of a community. They want to be loved. You may have, in certain individuals, it's not abnormal to be radical. So you have an uncle who is a fighter. So let's just do the family business. You may have someone, and this is happens often, is that when do you think, particularly if you think about religion, etc., or even other things, when you're vulnerable, it's often when you start seeking out new questions in life. It comes when, for example, when your parents die or someone you love die, etc. You start to think about the big questions in life. You can become a brooder, and then you have opened up. It's created a cognitive opening that you then can be influenced by whatever frames come in, and if you then happen to seek meaning, to seek order, you can then understand that you will be drawn to this. So you have different push and pull factors. So you have attractive factors that pull you towards an ideology. For example, if you're a gang member and you live a chaotic life and you don't know who's going to whack you, you then may want to leave that environment. You don't want to do it anymore. You're afraid. What this religious ideology offers you is structure and very clear guidelines of what is permissible, what is not permissible. And you go and you embrace this, right?
You know exactly what to do.
You know exactly what to do. You know there are rules, there are regulations. You will sort out your life. So many of the people who left for Syria, they ran from something towards something that seemed to be like a utopia.
You know the story of Anna Sundberg?
Yes.
Yeah. She was a guest on the pod.
Yeah. She was a convert, and she fell in love, and she didn't have the keys to be able to navigate because the person she married also was a very ideologically driven person who
he was a radical.
He was radical, and you can be you can be drawn into these things. I mean, I there is this documentary called Alone Against ISIS, Ensamma mot IS in Swedish, and I met this girl. She was a bit of a rebel rouser. She was not a Muslim. She met this boy who was an immigrant, who was in trouble, and he said, let's go on a vacation at the age of 15. So they went all the way to Syria. And all of a sudden she found herself in ISIS country. And then they went to Iraq. And he was sent to the front. He died. And there she was, pregnant. And alone. She was 15, 16. So she called home. And the parents managed through intervention to pull her back, and she was rescued by someone, and I met her, and she knew nothing about the ideology. She knew nothing. She just was in the wrong place. She met the wrong person, and then she was drawn into this, and forever she will be associated with this.
Do you think that most of us walking around are only 1 or 2 or 3 nudges towards some type of radical position?
Depends on what protective factors we have. So if you have if you have stable sort of upbringing, often it comes down to normal things. Why do you become a gang criminal, etc.? It means that maybe you don't have any prospects in life, or that your parents were absent, or that you had terrible upbringing. And then you just have to sort of fill it with meaning and fill it with ideology.
So do you classify like the narco organizations in Latin America as terrorist organizations?
Some of them may be terrorist organizations because they also have an ideological focus, like FARC, guerrilla, or they also do use terrorism, etc., or the ELN. The sister sort of organization to FARC. They did terrible things. Actually, one of the worst weapons I've actually seen of a terrorist organization is by, I think it was the FARC or the ELN, who did necklace bombs. So what they did was they superglued a bomb around your neck, and basically they did this for monetary gain. So if you didn't pay ransom, then, and there were a couple of those going off in the early 2000s. Yeah, it's terrible. So it just shows also how, the evil nature of, if you're committed enough, and if you're involved long enough, and if you've been indoctrinated long enough, then you can go into a really dark place. And that's what we saw with Hamas and the fact that people, there were people who were killing there who called home.
I listened to that.
Yeah.
He was celebrating on a WhatsApp call to his dad or his whole family. Look at these Jews I killed.
Yeah.
Look at me. I killed Jews. Like, are you proud?
Yeah. No, it's
and I don't know what to... kind of what I asked you earlier about the media coverage of this. I don't know what to necessarily believe or not, but some things I'll read, and the way that Jewish people are being educated the way that they are being discussed within the Gaza schooling system, if it's true, it's like obviously you're going to become radicalized. You're going to grow up in a world where nothing good is. These people are the enemy from day one. Yeah. No wonder you grow up into be a young adult, and it's like my whole purpose is to murder these people.
Yeah, and often the most important thing is these people, they dehumanize another human being. So it's, they use terminology about them that they don't talk to them about them as, for example, politicians. They are the system, or they are the enemy. So the language they use, but then also there's an interesting phenomena as well, and that is the group dynamics. What happens when you are with other people doing stuff that can also stretch what you will do yourself. And if you are living in a small group, being scared of being detected, or be going on a mission, etc., then you can be very scared of actually leaving the group. There's so much pressure. So what Hamas used to do before this operation was that they would groom suicide bombers, and they would actually let them lie on the ground, because they celebrate death more than life. So you reward this as a martyr in heaven, all the rewards. But they would have fighters go and lie in their graves so they can feel what it feels like.
That's powerful.
And then in these group dynamics, they would also videotape them giving their last testimony. So if you videotape someone, then you can't really back out,
totally,
right?
Totally. Oh my God.
And they would also do another thing. They would guide them. They would actually travel with them, maybe a little separate, so they wouldn't, if they were detected, that the handler would not see. They would travel with them towards the target. And at the last minute, they would tell them what the target was, so they didn't have too much to think about this.
Of course, yeah.
And there were also sometimes they would remote detonate the explosives, so that they didn't know. Some of them didn't know that they were, driving in a car that was completely packed with explosives, and then they reached a checkpoint, and then they would blow them up.
Wow. I mean, you're not religious, right?
No.
Okay. So I don't know what it would be like to be so certain and confident that you were going to some glorious afterlife.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's a pretty compelling motivation.
It is, if you know one, and this has to do with metaphysical, what happens after we die. So, most people get more religious as the older they get. The closer to death you get, but also
the more you think about it.
And the more you think about it, and also when people start dying around you, and when you get older, you need comfort.
Is there anything particularly pernicious about Islam or violent?
Well, I think that there are certain sort of interpretation in relation to Salafism, that the Salafi jihadism, ideology, basically they are very devout, follow the first 3 generations of the companions to the Prophet, so they're very literalist, and it's very rigid in relation to the boundaries in which what you do. So they regulate how you go to the toilet, how you dress, how you behave, social codes, etc. So they're very... Now, over time, there's been ideologues that have come in and build up certain dimensions which then legitimize violence. But these are minority groups. They are very few. So no, some would say that maybe there are some Quranic verses that can be interpreted as more violent than others, and yes, they are. But religion is is only as much as people make it. You have to operationalize a religion. So how you interpret that, it's up to you. But Islam is to submit, and there are different schools within Sunni Islam, and then of course you have Shia, and you have other groups that are maybe not as minority groups, but also not recognized as being. They count themselves as Muslim, but they're not seen as Muslim. For example, the Ahmadiyya community are not recognized by some of the mainstream Sunni groups, even though they do great work and they count themselves as Muslims. So, I wouldn't look at sort of Islam as where we have a problem is with Islamism, where you're trying to create a society based on particular, based on Sharia law, but gradually re-Islamicize and changes the legislation, the secular legislation, to more religious-based legislation. So I think it's important to understand that, first of all, religion is what you make it to be, and there are lots of different ideologues that can interpret, twist, etc. But mainly the radical realm has grown out of the fact that when they tried to re-Islamicize society as a reaction to westernization, to colonialism, to the states in the Middle East have been very repressive against Muslim communities, which have then radicalized them into more violent interpretations. So there are certain ideologues that are important for those who interpret it in a violent way.
Yeah. Could there be some truth to the idea that that maybe many of these Middle Eastern economies, for the average person, isn't a place that's offering you that much opportunity to sort of level up your life and your family's life? And you're a devout Muslim, and you've been sort of promised this land and promised a certain way of life by either the Quran or by your teachers or whatever. But then you look around and none of it actually looks that way, and then you just start blaming another person. Yeah. Maybe if I kill them, it'll be better for my kids. Is that too bad of a reading into something?
A little bit. I don't think it's right in the last part. So, but the other part is that first of all, we in the West, our religion is democracy, the rule of law. We are secular.
Is that religion though?
Well, it's a religion in the sense that it's a faith system that we cannot compromise on, in that we have worked so hard to create it, individual rights and freedoms, gender equality, etc. And then that clashes with religious norms, patriarchal structures, clan-based system, family, extended family. Middle Eastern societies, I think, are quite happy because you have huge extended families. I mean, you're never alone, right? So in a secular society, we don't value older people, but there you look up to older people and have respect them, and they don't have sort of loneliness in many of. It doesn't have to be Muslim societies. You look at China. Look at Chinese families and others. It's massive families, It's like a whole solar system. And here we have, we are in the Western society more like Pluto. We are solitary planets, maybe, and hopefully sometimes we can cluster together. And I think that is that can be a problem. But then, yes, of course, if you see what many of these sort of theocracies and others try to do is to control. It's like an autocratic dictatorship that tries to say, look at what happened in Iran, right? Women wants to not wear the chador, or they They want to be liberated. They want to have sexual freedom. They want to be able to date whoever they want. They want to be able to have a free life. The value is our religion, right? This is our religion. Be all you can be. But they don't have those freedoms. And of course, when you see that all around you with social media, etc., it creates conflicts. And the problem with the Middle East is that they were, the states there were arbitrarily determined, right? With a ruler and different mandate systems, etc. And then, of course, some of them discovered oil. Oh my God! And then they, some of those states trying to export this super religious, so they can combine being super rich but also believing in this, Salafi way, Wahhabi way.
We've gone quite a while. I was going to bring up Paris, but maybe we just don't have enough time. The only reason I was going to bring it up was to be in contrast to Anders Brevik as two different types of terrorism.
I can very quickly go.
If you want to give us the cliff notes, I think that'd be fascinating. Just because I remember in my own lifetime, that's probably the only terrorist attack that I was really, really close to, with the Bali bombings, which were a big deal in Australia, but I was too young to really notice it, as the London bombings. But I have a very distinct memory. I was in Europe at the time at a party, and there were a lot of French people at the party, and the news started sort of breaking out because people had their phones. And then we all sort of learnt about what was happening as it was ongoing. And my roommate at the time, who was French, his brother worked in the Secret Service, brother-in-law, apologies, and he was one of the first responders into the auditorium. Anyway, so I remember thinking at the time, this is so unbelievably horrific, but then so surprised at how the French just sort of shrugged it off and got on with life. Anyway, that was the reason why I wanted to ask you about Paris.
Yeah, so what happened was that ISIS had a special unit. So when you entered into ISIS territory, you had to fill in a form of 23 questions, and it's like a control form of who you are, who are your parents, what's your home address, who got you in contact with ISIS, why did you come, what route did you take, etc. So every single ISIS recruit has one of those files. Now, there was also a box that you can tick that says, what do you want to do? Do you want to do an operation? Do you want to become a martyr? Or do you want to become a soldier? Or do you want to do an operation? So while they were being interviewed also to check that there are no spies, they also identified people who could potentially also be reinserted back into Europe. And in October 2014, when the caliphate has been established, there was the spokesperson for ISIS called Mohammed Adnani, and he made a directive, and he said, look, whatever means you have at your disposal, use it. If it's a truck, a car, a knife, strike at the infidels, strike at our enemies. Now, one of the first operations that was undertaken was against Charlie Hebdo in Paris. And there were two brothers called the Kouachi brothers, and they stormed into the Charlie Hebdo newspaper, and they gunned down all of them, and then there was a manhunt for them. But they also had a friend. And these two Kouachi brothers had been trained by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But their friend, he would later do an operation just a day or two afterwards against the Jewish supermarket, Hyper Caché, and in Paris, where they took Jews as hostage, and they killed some of them. Interestingly, he belonged to ISIS. So you had like a joint operation, Al-Qaeda and ISIS sort of almost together. Now everyone woke up, my God, what's happening? Terrible attack, gunned down the whole sort of, it was an assault against Charlie Hebdo. and freedom of expression, freedom of being able to joke about or blasphemous expressions. And then, of course, in November of 2015, and later on in Brussels in 2016 in March, you had massive operations. Both of these operations are tied together because it's the same people who were participating in planning and supporting, etc. Now, ISIS had identified a whole collection of individuals which they trained for this specific mission to attack Paris and Brussels. And what they did was that they trained them and then they inserted them through the asylum, when the mass migration, mass asylum seeking wave came. They came in through, the Balkan route, and they came in the asylum streams. They then met up in particular places, picked up, assembled in Molenbeek, which is a suburb of Brussels in Belgium. That's where the operational base is. And then the different people were starting to plan the operation. So they attacked, two teams attacked Stade de France. They tried to get into the match that was being played. But I think also the French Prime Minister or French President, I don't know who was at the match, but there was a French political leader at the match. They couldn't get in, they exploded themselves, but there was another team that went roaming in Paris against restaurants, but also ended up in the Bataclan, and in the Bataclan there was a rock band playing, and they began gunning down people there. And it was a massive massacre of people. In fact, one of my students was injured with a gunshot in Paris at one of the restaurants. Her friends were killed, and then they went into hiding, and there was a manhunt. And as the manhunt went from Paris to Brussels, they forwarded the operation, and the operation was to walk into Brussels airport, Zaventem, and you had two suicide bombers there who killed a lot of people in the check-in areas. But there were others who were going to do an operation. They did an operation in the underground, in Brussels. One of them was a Swede, and the person was a Swede from Malmö, and he had been tasked also previously to go to the Schiphol, the Dutch airport, to case out and to see if he can do an operation there at the same time as the Paris attacks, but he didn't do it. He came back, and then later on he was arrested. He was convicted for both the Paris attacks as well as the Brussels attack. But they were massive attacks. They were all interconnected, and they had exploited the lack of law enforcement capability that the Brussels federal police have. There are lots of different sort of federal fiefdoms in Brussels, which makes them vulnerable. A good place to hide.
And then they just drove down to Paris.
Well, first they did the Paris. Yes, they drove from Molenbeek to Paris, and then they did the operation. Interestingly, they used prepaid credit cards in order not to, which are anonymous. And one of the consequences of the Paris attack was that you're not allowed to. They sort of tighten up so that you cannot have anonymous credit cards anymore. You cannot sort of fill them up with money. You have to link an identity to the persons. And interestingly, those were very massive attacks that, of course, also galvanized European countries to go into high gear to counter this threat.
And how has France been so successful at mitigating further attacks since then?
First of all, there's been so many attacks. There's been also, horrific attacks, because you have a large pool of suspects. You have something like 20,000 people that are national security threats. They had over 2,000 foreign fighters. They have the highest number of any European country. Some of those who were part of this terror unit within ISIS were French. That's why they focused also on France. France is also tough on the Muslim communities because they believe in laïcité and they believe in secularism, and the religious should be very private. But you had a lot of different attacks. You had the Nice attack with a truck driving down Nice promenade. You had other attacks. You had, they even went into a church and beheaded a priest. Two perpetrators. They went on the Thalys, and luckily there was a U.S. Marine on board, but they were going to use an attack on a train. There were so many other attacks. There was massive amounts of attacks. But the French have been really good at using their intelligence, using their military. And in continental Europe, there have been massive amounts of attacks that have occurred. But they have a good idea of who they are. They're not starting from zero, and they build up a sort of an intelligence dossier it's like a puzzle, and you have some pieces of puzzle. The big weakness is that the French have had the prisons are universities for becoming terrorists because they don't have any de-radicalization.
The French prisons particularly?
Yes, because there are too many inmates that have this problem, and they don't do a lot of work. The way they structure the prisons is not particularly good. So there are many cases where people have actually met up with other terrorists in prison, and then they started planning.
Man. You're such an encyclopedia of all these terrorist networks and their attacks over time. I just wonder, why do you do this as a career?
Well, you never plan these things, and I never thought that you could have a career in this. And I just, by chance, I was interested in the excitement. I was, you get adrenaline kicks, and I was excited about this issue. I saw, it had like this drama to it, and I was drawn to that. It's almost like real life Netflix, and then of course you happen to place yourself in situations out of curiosity, out of interest, as a challenge to try to figure out how do these cells work. How does intelligence services find them? And what is this sort of tradecraft? It's almost like, action movie with spy movie combined. And this sphere is something that most people don't think about when they go to bed at night. They just think, oh, well, we're safe today, etc. But behind the scenes are an army of people working day and night, just like in the movies, to try to keep you safe. Yeah. And then also, it's not just excitement. It's also about doing something meaningful and doing something unique, and also changing people's lives. Also being affected by. I think you get a little bit. You get affected by horrible things that you see, but also you think about the victims. And look, you and I can go to bed at night. We can sort of put off the light. it's not our families that have died in all of this. We can go on with our lives. We jump on to the next incidents. But when you start meeting people and they become your friends, so you knew who they are, etc., you then think it's important. I remember when I first started this, standing in this Lockerbie chapel, and there was a book with all the memories of all the victims, and they had a photograph, and I was just thinking, my God, this could be me, this could be anyone, and their life was taken out without, in a horrible way. What happened on the Lockerbie plane was that the pressure between, the depressurized cabin and the outside pressure also meant that when the bomb exploded on board on 30,000 feet level, the nose cone of a Boeing 747 broke out, almost like opening a can. So it was bending backwards, and one piece of the front end hit the motor. They've determined that after the fact. And of course, everyone lost consciousness, and you would be killed by the debris as the plane is breaking up, etc. But they've also sort of, it takes about 35 seconds before, going from 30,000 feet down to the ground, where you will die from the impact as well. But just the thought of, because I fly all the time, just the thought of this happening up there, and that actually you may wake up. You may wake up the last sort of 7 seconds, and that's the theory that they had, that there were some that did wake up, but they probably wouldn't know what was happening around them. But anyway, when you stand there in that chapel and you look at those pictures and you think about their families and you think about, how come they had to die, I think often about the 35, kids who went to Syracuse University who were my age, who never came home to their families. And to some extent, there are lots of different victims. There are also victims in the war against terrorism, that states have gone too far in the military interventions, etc., in different ways, that you also affect other people. But unless you yourself have been affected by either the war on terrorism or by terrorists themselves, it's difficult to comprehend. And so therefore, you do this. I want to say something positive, and that is I've met incredible people. So one of the persons I met was who I look up to. I met this UN diplomat who resolved the Western hostage crisis in Lebanon, Gian Domenico Pico, who was a 2-meter tall Italian diplomat who was wearing dapper Italian suits, etc., who let himself be kidnapped by Hezbollah in Lebanon 4 times. Why? Because he was on a personal mission to help these hostages. He didn't have to do it. That was not in part of his job description, etc. And after he resolved that issue, he called me up 10 years later when I had met him. He said, "Magnus, I need you." And he said, "I can't go because there's a hostage situation between Israel and Hezbollah, so I'm going to send you." And how can I say no to that? So it's been a series of accidental encounters and things that have happened. There was never a plan like this. But also, it's interesting, it's exciting, but it's also one of the reasons why I wrote the book is you also get tired. And you need to close part of your life in a chapter and then put it down, because my kids, I was away a lot when my kids grew up on different overseas travel. So I thought, well, I made while I remember it, I'll write it down.
So the book is also almost a conclusion to a career as well?
Well, you never know when you're going to go, right?
Okay.
So I've learned that. But
Serendipity can come back.
exactly, no. But it's while I still remember everything, and while there is makes sense to me, I thought it was about time that if I wait another 10 years, who knows what will happen during that time. So I wanted to write that, and that was my story. And if you have a book about your life, then it will be there forever.
Yeah.
So
no, it's an amazing thing.
yeah.
And you've been so generous with your time. So please tell me if I'm taking too much of it.
No.
But just a few more quick ones if we can get them out of the way.
Yeah.
Although that is a perfect place to end it. There are a few questions I haven't asked yet.
You can rearrange.
A tough one to start off. How much are Swedes to blame for the failed integration between the parallel societies in this country?
I think integration and segregation, etc., goes multiple ways. So I think Swedes are very open and very welcoming. We are a consensus-loving country. We don't like conflict with people. You laugh because you could probably recognize this. And we mean well. We have an image of ourselves as the moral guardians of the world. We have been welcoming people into the country, but we're very poor at taking care of them. So the government policy has been to be generous, but then of course at the local level they are I wouldn't say dumped, but they are placed, and they are you have to. The problem is that the ones who live in socially segregated areas, we have 60 places that are socially segregated, where the police have more difficult time operating. They can operate in all areas, but they have difficulty. And then you have criminal elements, you have parallel society, you have drugs, you have other things that are happening. The problem is that those who live in those areas, the ones who can make it out of there, they will move. And then you have more people coming in who are socially weak. In other words, they don't know the language, they have maybe large families, they're culturally far away from society, they're not educated enough, etc. So I think part of the issue is, of course, you have to have agency yourself to be able to lift yourself and to be willing not to encapsulate yourself into your own society, etc. And I think maybe there Sweden is a bit too generous when it comes to giving out public money to different associations and cultural associations, etc. Because it doesn't lead so much to integration. It leads to segregation. It may lead to pulling apart society. But I think that your question is more sort of general in relation to what responsibility do ordinary Swedes have.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so it's not government policy.
As you negotiate your day-to-day.
Yeah. No, I think Swedes have a responsibility to be open to foreign cultures and to have that sort of receptiveness. The difficulty is for some of the societies is to interact with a particular dimension of Swedish culture, and that is alcohol. So a lot of our midsummer celebration, others revolve around alcohol. Now that doesn't have to be a problem, but normally it's sort of you're not part of that way. But you also have to be receptive of being receptive as a person to other cultures. Problem is that many Swedes, they never travel to really experience other cultures on their terms. So they don't go to the Middle East a lot because unless you're from the area, or they may not go to Africa, they may not go to, I'm generalizing, but I think that most people go to holiday destinations just to have fun, to swimming, sunbathing, etc. And I'm not talking about the United States. I'm not talking about West. Well, I'm talking about Spain, etc. But also the U.S. maybe. But it's not to the developing world where you have different cultural norms, where you have different dimensions that are radically different from our society. if you're not then exposed to that, you then are not as open to be open. So you close yourself with saying, look, it's our way or the highway, right? This is what they're going to say.
Yeah.
So, look, accept our rules or get out.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's kind of okay, isn't it?
It's okay
Except Swedes don't say that.
No, it's okay, but that's why certain parties have grown as a result of the fact that you don't want to deal with the real issue, the real world.
Right. That's true. But to your point, exactly.
No,
I think that mentality is the same in the UK, the US, and Australia.
Yeah.
I think Australia is amazing when it comes to welcoming other cultures.
Yeah.
But we make it super explicit. This is what it is to be an Australian. The Swedes, it's all implicit.
It's all
You
implicit.
will never be told.
No.
This is actually how you were supposed to behave.
And this is exactly you have actually put your finger on exactly what is the problem, is that you have to have very strict guidelines. And we have to say, look, there are some rules here, and my red line, this is why I do all of this work. What motivates me is to ensure that our religion, democracy, rule of law, individual rights and freedoms, and gender equality is upheld. That you are not allowed to infringe on someone else's human rights. You're not allowed to tell your wife, or anyone. You cannot restrict them from dating, from marrying, from all the freedoms that is our religion. And there we come into conflict with some of the cultures and religions, religious norms, etc. And I think we are super bad at and actually saying, okay, this is the boundaries. This is you operate within. This is what you need to do, and then the rest of the time you can do. But as long as you respect all these rights, and we're never going to yield. We have to spoon feed them. You have to learn the language. You have to get a job. You have to at least try to do that, etc. But instead, we are a social welfare society where it's equally as profitable to have many kids and not work and stay at home. And if you come from a patriarchal society, when you have many kids, it's difficult to start work. Anyway, so
totally,
we have to have some limits to how far do we pay different. How far should the social welfare state go? And I think we've been really bad. And I get upset every time I go out to these sort of different areas because we then become a very unequal society. There will always be inequality in societies, but when you look at the sort of conditions, most people just want to get by out in these areas. But they have to navigate two things. One is gang criminals, and the other is religious extremism, who wants to sort of tell you what to do and not to do, and who spy on you. So, and that becomes a very unsafe environment. If your kids are running on the street, etc., the likelihood of them becoming a gang criminal, etc., being groomed into something is getting younger and younger.
So brutal. Brutal.
Yeah. So we have a lot to learn from our neighbors, Denmark particularly. They also break up socioeconomically deprived areas. So they actually play with the parameters of, if you look at an area that's socially deprived, how many people are unemployed? Who lives in these, how many people are unemployed who are living in a particular building? What is their age brackets? Are they students? Are they pensioners, etc.? So they don't let these segregated areas sort of fester. Yeah.
That must be super difficult to actually pull the trigger on, though.
Well, I mean, I in 2015, right after Charlie Hebdo, the mayor of Copenhagen came to me and said, "Would you take on the task of leading the anti-radicalization action plan for our city?" And we had one meeting, and then, of course, there was a terrorist attack in Copenhagen against Lars Vilks, cartoonist, but also against the Jewish synagogue. As part of my task to put together this action plan with the police and social services and others, I went out and visited where this terrorist came from. And in the neighborhood, I found that They are not as socially deprived as the ones in Sweden. They actually had something really interesting going. Particularly the housing associations were doing a fantastic job. They were having, career coaching for women, so women could get a job. There were elderly males in living in the area who were respected, who took care of the youth, and they were delivering newspapers and commercial newspapers, etc., to all the residents. There were doctors and nurses locally who were. You don't go to the doctor; they come to you, right? So they would collect them there. You had gang criminals who had defected or had left the environment, who were working in containers. And what were they doing in the containers? They were repairing cars or bikes for free. So if you're a resident and your car broke down, you would go to the gang criminal. He will fix your car for free. Or the youngsters would come with their bikes and said, I have a flat tire, and they would fix it for free. So if you create connections locally in housing estates with the residents and you have some structure, then you're going to be okay.
So fascinating.
Yeah. And easy concepts, easy way of, how do you relate? How do you create trust? But, it's not done enough.
Look, I really can't keep taking your time. So a few quick ones.
Yeah.
See how fast you can get through them.
Okay.
What's the most effective propaganda you've ever seen?
ISIS movies who are super slick, who actually uses the latest animation and but also innovative way creates the feeling that you want to belong to this.
What is the scariest terror group you've ever studied?
ISIS.
Why?
They are so brutal, beheading, this sort of complete lack of any boundaries, even when you kill. So I've seen ISIS movies where they have shown that how do you stab someone? And they had hung up a person on a fence in white.
A real corpse?
A real person alive.
Oh, shit.
And it was like a cooking course, right? So it's like, this is how you do it. And person took out a knife, like a huge, steak knife, quite a massive cooking knife, and walked over and stabbed the person multiple times. Also horrible to watch beheading videos when they are sawing on a head, and when they are doing very cruel things. And there has not been any terrorist organization that has been so cruel like ISIS, besides Hamas. And that's why the Israelis say Hamas is ISIS. Not ideologically, I mean, they're similar, but there may be some overlapping dimensions. But in terms of cruelty, ISIS and Hamas is pretty close.
And how much more power does ISIS have?
ISIS is still around. They have a massive amount of pulling power in the Sahel in Africa, and there's nothing stopping them there. You have ISIL Khorasan province in Afghanistan who are bent on hitting us in the West. There are territories still that have plenty of ISIS individuals, so you can't really sort of eradicate ISIS. It's also in Southeast Asia, Pakistan, others. And so you have all these groups still there.
There's a whole... one of my questions here, I won't ask it to you, but it was about if you could lay on a map, lay on the table a map and just go through each continent and identify terrorist organizations. That's a super confronting thing to do.
Yeah.
Because as you were talking, I haven't thought about Africa for these last 3 hours. But as you mentioned, it's like, oh yeah, of course. There is millions of people there that
The
are
millions of
susceptible to radicalization. And
yeah, and they have little defense against that, and ISIL is using local grievances to expand, and they are expanding across the Sahel, West Africa, Niger, Mozambique. You have all the way across to Al-Shabaab, which is another organization that is super brutal and is still there. So you have many of these ungoverned spaces or difficult to control spaces that are quite susceptible to different forms of groups that is going to take advantage. So now we face a huge struggle ahead, and it will never be resolved in my kid's lifetime.
That would actually almost just be worth like a short little video or even short little podcast, geographically mapping out terrorist organizations throughout the world.
Yeah.
But this is a weird question.
Mm-hmm.
Are you a bit of a historian? Do you cast your eye back? Okay. Is there terrorist organizations always throughout history?
Yes. You have organizations, the zealots, you have, anarchist group in and around First World War. You have, yes, you have had also, thugs. So you have had a lot of groups that have confronted adversaries throughout history that exists. But also, the terrorist groups, they also look towards the future in a way. For example, ISIS. What does ISIS want? Right? You would think, what does ISIS want? They want to herald in the doomsday by establishing an Islamic State and by confronting and defeating. Defeating Shia. They hate Shia more than they hate the West. So they defeat Shia, and then they're going to conquer Rome and the West, and they're going to conquer the world.
Am I ignorant in thinking that this is some type of mind rot?
Well, they have a strong belief in their doomsday. These are doomsday prophecies. So they want to herald in the doomsday, and they feel that they are at the spearhead of this, and that when the last battles and when the last sort of the day of reckoning will come, they are saved. So it's about saving yourself. It's about becoming saved, and that's why they have conjured up sort of rewards in heaven, with 72 virgins, with land of milk and honey. And it's like, okay, what's life worth if not struggling for that? And then that has become, for many, this is not just radicals. This is for Muslims in general, and for others as well. Christians have also Christians and other religions, and basically. It's sort of making sense and meaning out of life, because otherwise you're just born and then you die, and then there's nothing.
But is that so bad? I don't know. I between you and me and everyone listening, but I'm working on Big Ambition is a book, but multiple sort of long essays on the philosophy of absurdism.
Yeah.
Which is a worldview which essentially just totally finds meaning in the idea that we are a impossible fluke of evolution.
Yeah.
We're meat and bones.
Yeah.
We're here for a couple spins, and then we're forgotten.
Yes. Which is true.
Which I think is the case.
I think it's true,
Yes.
because you think about life, different stages in life, and then you think of what it's like when you are a child and you have your supportive family and your parents, etc. And then all of a sudden they're like trees.
Yeah.
And people and your important trees die, and you never see other people dying. And they've had a mark through me. So they made a mark through me, and then maybe I have children and I make some marks, etc. But it's, sometimes when sometimes if you have done something stupid, maybe it's just time to go to bed. Right? You wake up and it's a new day, and then you've forgotten the stupid stuff you did the day before. But that day, sometimes your days is going to come to an end, and then the question is, okay, are you happy with how you made a dent in your life?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you have to be content with this, and that is why.
Given the finite nature, how do you find meaning and purpose?
And you probably do that because we are very social beings, and one of the worst things about Western societies and stuff is that they don't value family in the way in which other societies may do, or creating social meaning, particularly for elderly people. And I think there are a lot of elderly people. I sometimes walk around. I think about this because my mom used to run one of those places, and I grew up with that, taking care of old people. And I didn't think about it at the time when they were doing that, but I think about it today, that there are so many lonely people that are old and sitting in their apartment. The only social connection they make is when they go shopping, or if they can get out, they...
No, that's
and what kind of, that's a sad,
tragic. Yeah.
but that's a sad way of checking out, because they're going to check out. So that's a sad way. So the worst possible way is probably to die lonely, because no one will actually even know that the tree will fall in this forest.
No, but that is, we're all guilty of it.
Yeah. And therefore religion becomes...
I guess so.
A way to make meaning in a different way.
I haven't been able to come around to sympathizing with it yet.
No.
Also, is there a greater indication that religion is man-made than the sort of juvenile, sexually repressed idea that glory on earth is 72 virgins and milk and honey?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
it's a teenager's idea of a good day.
Exactly. No. But I think. But we have to respect the fact that people believe in different things. And
absolutely,
if
each
they
to
want,
their own.
If people want to believe that, that's fine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You actually answered this earlier. I ask every guest the role that serendipity has played in their life, and you were sort of inadvertently answering that question by talking about the random walk of your career, going from here to there. But I wonder if anything special stands out.
I think about being receptive to unique individual, making connections. That sometimes people become very self-serving in that when they meet people they want to get something out of it. But if they see goodness in people and that you get along together well, that can lead to great and beautiful things. And if you're open to that. So sometimes, people think that they can come into social networks and that they can use those social networks to get somewhere. Sometimes they can, but often it is about that personal connection, the chemistry that you make with a person that can never be bought, and that's also beautiful in the sense that you don't know where it will lead. So one of the persons that I met along my journey, we became friends, was, I don't know if you've seen the Netflix series Fauda? No. So you should see the Netflix series Fauda, which Fauda is about this sort of unit, the Israeli unit that exists in reality, that goes behind Palestinian enemy lines to try to find terrorists and find others, and the main person in that sort of series is called Doron, and you will notice him because he is the main character. He's bald, and he's relatively cool as a cucumber. Now I met the real life Doron in Israel, and this real life Doron was super hard guy who used to interrogate people. And I asked him once, what's the most effective way of interrogating someone? And he said, look, it's not about exerting physical pressure, even though sometimes that can help. It's about the psychological dance. If you can get them to talk, then you have something to pull. But I used to go with him, and we would eat, and he loved Frank Sinatra. So he would be on the radio when we were going in his Range Rover. He would be playing Frank Sinatra and singing all along. I mean, the whole way. And when we came to the restaurant, we were sitting there, seaside restaurant somewhere in Israel, and he would just sort of walk up and grab a mic, and he would sing to the entire restaurant. And so he would force me out of my comfort zone because I had to join him. And I hate singing.
So there's footage of you karaokeing out there?
There's no footage because it was before a lot of people sort of social media, but you would never experience that. So it doesn't have to be super serious. You just have to like people. And their serendipity is you have to be open when you meet those kind of people to invest in those people, not to try to get something out of them, but just enjoy being with them. And that's life.
Beautiful. Well said.
Yeah.
What a place to finish it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we've been charging on for almost 3.5 hours, so thank you so much for being generous with your time.
Has it been that long?
Yeah.
Well, okay. I apologize.
Yeah.
I like to talk a lot.
No, it was very compelling, and I think there will still be a lot of people around now.
Yeah, well, Godspeed.
Lovely. Thank you, Magnus.
All right, thank you.